Okay, I'm pleased to call to order the 45th public meeting of the Massachusetts Gaming Commission on Thursday, January 10th, 2013. First of all is approval of minutes from our last meeting. Commissioner McHugh.
The minutes were distributed yesterday afternoon, and welcome any substantive corrections. Otherwise, I'd move that they be adopted as distributed.
Second.
Any discussion, any issues? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. Okay, we're going to change our order here a little bit. It is as on the agenda. We're going to ask Ombudsman Ziemba to join us if he's here, along with his troops. Do you want to go straight to the permitting process, or Maeve and?
Maeve and Dave should be here very shortly, so why don't I give my ombudsman update, and then they'll join me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In regard to my update, I continue to have meetings and conversations with applicants and communities. Notably, I'm visiting an applicant tomorrow in Springfield and the city of Springfield. I spent a good amount of time discussing the draft permitting documents and asking for comments over this last week. In the course of these conversations, I fielded a lot of questions regarding the timing of our RFA1 licensing reviews and the timetable for referendums and referendum scheduling. I recommend that we discuss that timing further after we receive the RFA1 applications next week, and maybe we could provide a little more guidance to communities.
Are there issues? Substantive issues, or just people just want clarification?
I think people want clarification on how the 60 to 90 days works.
Okay.
With our RFA1 deadlines, and I think we probably have more information next week for them.
Right, okay.
I've received some questions regarding what the Commission's policies are regarding the design of gaming facilities. We had a policy discussion regarding how complete design must be prior to submission, but as a follow-up to our design forum that we held last year, there are people that are asking questions about what criteria that we would utilize for design. We just recently had a conversation this week where we followed up on that design forum to find out when the white paper, there was a promised white paper that was going to be submitted to us, and what I'd suggest is that potentially the Commission should discuss the policy of what design criteria we would utilize after receipt of that white paper. It's my understanding that the white paper will be available by the end of this month.
Right. Does that fit, Commissioner Stebbins? That's right?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's an important one, I think.
That's a good one. We've also fielded some questions regarding the process for community disbursements and the grant agreement that we've discussed in the last couple of weeks. Mr. Grossman will join us a little bit later, and we will give an update about the grant agreement, which has been drafted, and it should be available for the Commission, I believe, next week. I continue to work with regional planning agencies to fine-tune the process for helping host and surrounding communities. Primarily, the nearby impacted communities evaluate the impacts of potential gaming facilities. I'm expecting a detailed summary from the RPAs as early as today, and if not tomorrow. And this draft will give us an update on process and resources that would be necessary to help host and surrounding communities prior to the application that is submitted to the Commission. And over this last week, we've been working a lot with other agencies to develop our system to help communities and applicants work through the state permitting process and to finalize plans for infrastructure improvements. This builds upon the recommendation that was submitted to the Commission last week on the permitting question. So I think probably what I should do is just go into a little bit of the further discussion on permitting while we're joined by Maeve and Dave, and I think that'll work out.
Just ask you, we have community disbursement down here as this separate item. Is that,
Yeah, it's a separate item. We can discuss that where it is on the agenda.
you do want to do it? Okay.
Yep. So, at issue before the commission last week, and again this week, is a question regarding the level of state and local permitting that would be required by applicants prior to the submission of the RFA2 application. I thank the chairman for explaining in my absence the memo on this issue that was submitted. I think that the conversation was rather comprehensive, so I don't think I'll try to replicate it, but I would like to focus on just one aspect of the memo, notably its assistance that we will be receiving from other agencies, including MassDOT and Mass Department of Transportation, MassDOT, and the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and hopefully they'll be joining me here shortly. But in summary, what the recommendation that was included in that paper provided was that the agencies would help us in three different stages of our review of applications. Notably, post-award, and I recommended conditional licenses be granted. Post-award of conditional licenses, because as was stated in the recommendation, it is probably impossible for all of the applicants to fully go through the state and local permitting processes. It was recommended that we establish an interagency team to find ways to expedite permitting for applicants after the granting of a conditional license. I made.
Your interagency team is here, Tom.
Oh, I knew you would be.
As soon as you said
I
the
knew you would
words.
be.
Came together.
Why don't you, yeah, just drop your coats and come right on up, folks.
So I am joined by Dave Moeller, who is the Executive Director of the Office of Transportation Planning for the Mass Department of Transportation. Oh, that's right. Let me help you.
So do you need to sit there with
No,
me?
I don't.
No. We just need to make sure that you do speak close enough to those mics when you speak.
And we welcome back Mae Valley Bartlett, who is the State MEPA Director. So as I was beginning, what I'd like to focus on is the multi-stage process where other agencies are going to help us in our review of applications. And post-award of the conditional licenses, what we are recommending jointly is that over the next series of weeks and months, that we develop a process to expedite permitting after the granting of conditional licenses. And we don't have any firm recommendations for you today about what those, how we will go about expediting those permits, but primarily, I think that there is a recognition all the way from the governor's office to the legislature to the commission that this is an extremely important group of applicants to the economic development goals of the Commonwealth. And each of the respective secretariats has noted that it will dedicate very significant resources to make sure that these applications proceed through the permitting process as quickly as possible. I note that Chairman Crosby and I attended a meeting recently in the governor's office that was attended by the respective cabinet secretaries in the governor's office, where we discussed how important it is to try to move all of these applications through the permitting process as quickly as possible. However, I do note, based on the discussion from last week's conversation, that since applicants will not have proceeded some applicants will not have proceeded all the way through the permitting process prior to the time of the application, that there may be some significant time that is associated with applicants proceeding through the permitting process. And we just want to make sure that people realize that ahead of time. What we did do in our recommendation is that we recommended that readiness to proceed would be one of the criteria by which we would evaluate all applicants. So it is a recommendation that entities that are applying to the commission, that they proceed as far as they can through the state and local processes. But we recognize that that involves a number of different resource questions by the applicants, and also resource questions by the state. We'll have numerous applicants, and if we ever were to require a full-baked review of all of those prior to our application, if indeed that were possible, that would involve a very significant outlay of resources that would detract from all the other Commonwealth's needs. So what we've agreed is that post the award of the conditional licenses, we will work on the recommendations that we formulate over the next couple of months on trying to expedite permitting as much as possible. Maeve will discuss the MIPA process and how the MIPA process is a very quick process from the time that they receive applications or filings to the time that they make their certificates, but a lot of it is dependent upon the applicant. So she'll discuss that a little bit in her remarks. All right, so that is I started with the third stage first. The second stage is that the agencies have agreed to provide us with evaluations during our review process. They will help us take a look at the applications. They will help us evaluate the completeness of the applications, whether or not particular aspects of their applications are possible if they haven't been fully vetted, what it would take to fully vet them, what are the risks associated with each of those aspects of the applications. And notably, infrastructure improvements will be a big part of the review, and obviously the MassDOT agencies have very significant expertise and resources to help us evaluate applicants and what they're submitting.
This fits together with the project that Commissioner Zuniga has, which is assembling. We're going to have to assemble a team to help us review all the applications and knowing what the resources are at the state and really understand what we're going to be able to get from them. They were very generous to say they're happy to help. Right. But I think that we need to be clear with them and they with us so we know what expectations are. Yes.
So we've had some preliminary discussions about the timetable when that would occur, but I think over the next couple of weeks and months we will finalize with the commissioner exactly what would be necessary, what resources would be necessary, and what procedures need to be developed. Specifically, there are other statutory processes that all of these applicants go through. And they would still be required to follow all of those statutory processes, and that what we would do here does not impact that. So the final stage that I'll discuss, which is the first stage, is agency technical advice prior to the application. The Commission has previously discussed, and for very valid reasons, has decided that it will not be involved in formulating for communities what should be in their host community agreements. Communities and applicants are, many of them are in the depth of many conversations about what should be included in those community agreements. But the one item that bears a little bit more of a discussion is those community agreements may be based on ideas of infrastructure primarily, that will be included in those host community agreements. And because these, the infrastructure which is included in those agreements may not be fully vetted yet, there will be a lot more review through the processes I just identified, there is a danger that they could potentially not reflect the current reality of what we think is a potentially best course for that infrastructure, for example. So what we hope to do is we hope to provide a method to properly inform communities prior to the time that they ink their host community agreements what the current thinking is of the agencies that will be involved in the permitting processes and the infrastructure improvement processes at a later date. So what we are recommending is that this interagency group will communicate with host communities and surrounding communities that are involved in a surrounding community agreement, and we will give them the latest information that is available on the infrastructure that is planned for each of the developments, so that the communities will know about any obstacles that may be faced as it proceeds through the permitting process. Now, we have to stress that this information that will be provided is only as good as the information that is provided to us. So if a plan is a lot more fully baked, we'll be able to provide a little bit more information to the communities about how realistic a plan that is. If a plan is still in the development stages, we'll take that information and we will give our best advice based on that information. Included within this recommendation is the recommendation that applicants shall file an environmental notification form prior to the application that they submit to the commission. So if indeed an applicant files an ENF before a host community agreement is executed, the agencies can take the review that they did for the ENF and use that as a way to inform communities. But because not all applicants may be able to proceed to ENF prior to the execution of a host community agreement, what we will then ask for is we will ask, after numerous conversations with the communities, give us the best available information that the applicant has about the status of their plans, and we will work from that in giving you this initial advice.
But this is, I think you made this very clear, but this is a service you're going to offer to the community, we're going to offer to the community.
That is right.
It's not a precondition of anything, it's not giving them obligatory parameters or anything like that. It's resources that we will make available as they wish to make use of them.
Exactly.
I mean, I hope everybody will, but
Yeah.
I want to just reinforce that this is voluntary, right? Okay.
That's exactly right. So, so we jointly are working on all stages of this multi-stage review. And I want to thank Maeve and Dave for all of their efforts to make this process as smooth as possible, and I want to thank them for all of their valuable advice. I had numerous conversations with them prior to making the recommendation of the commission. I think there probably is a general feeling that, hey, if everyone were able to fully go through the permitting process prior to the time of the application, that would provide the most up-to-date information, and that would be the easiest possible. But however, I think that there is a reality that there are very significant economic returns that the Commonwealth wants to get, and we may need to obviously ask for applications prior to the completion of these processes. So I thank them again for their help in that regard. So let me first ask Maeve to explain how her agencies will be a participant in this process. Obviously, she previously gave you the benefit of how the MEPA process will factor into the evaluation of gaming applicants, but I'd like her a little bit to further expound on this, and then I'll ask Dave to give us the benefit of what his agencies think they can bring to the table, and specifically I think he's planning on talking about how the current process works with the public-private development unit over at Executive Office of Transportation in tandem with Dave's Office of Transportation Planning on evaluating projects of this size, maybe not this size, but close to this size every day. So there's very significant expertise and experience that they will bring to the table, and I'll ask Dave to give a little more update on that. Thank you, Maeve.
Thank you, John. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Nice to see you again. Basically, as I discussed previously, the MEPA process is an informal administrative process where state agencies who are envisioned to be giving a permit for a project will comment through the MEPA process before the applicant then goes to get their permit. So it's actually perfectly suited for the type of coordination that I believe you're looking for in terms of these projects. So if a project were to come into us, that the general decision was this needs that type of help in terms of expedition, we could gather together the agencies who will be involved. And typically from a MEPA standpoint, that would be DOT, that would be DEP, Natural Heritage at Fish and Game, and those people would be, we would identify individuals who would work with the MEPA office and be involved every step of the way, so that those agencies who are going to deliver, who are going to look at a permit at the end of the MEPA process would already be very well aware of what the project is and what the impacts are. MEPA is designed to look at the impacts of various alternatives and the impacts that will be looked at in permitting. So it is actually, as I said, it's quite an effective vehicle, I think, to assist these applicants with moving forward through permitting. And now, that is environmental permitting, and to the extent that we're looking at traffic, it's DOT. It's not the whole range of any permit that someone may need. It's a lot of important things, but it's not the entire universe. And I did want to stress something that John stressed a number of times, which is, we scope the project. They come in with an environmental notification form, which is not wildly extensive. It's a form that people fill out to give the broad parameters of what the impacts are. The secretary then looks at that information and gives them the certificate on the scope of issues that he wants analyzed. So he would say, you need to look at wetlands, you need to talk to DOT, you need to tell us what the impacts are in this range. To the extent that a proponent can get that information quickly and satisfactorily, give us a robust discussion of those issues, they come back into MIPA with that. And as John said, then we turn it around really quickly. So we say that MIPA is proponent-driven because our timelines on review and public process are quite succinct. It's the work that goes on in between the various elements of MIPA, between the ENF, between the DEER certificate, until the final certificate comes in. So if we call them motivated proponents, we'll do a robust analysis, answer everything that we've asked for in our scopes, and then we move quickly on it. But again, MIPA does bring in all of the state agencies who are giving environmental permits, and we can use that vehicle to assist with expediting these projects.
Thank you, ma'am.
Want me to talk now?
That'd be great. Thank you, Dave.
So for DOT's purposes, we are involved in this process from beginning to end. At the beginning, generally how this works is an ENF is filed, DOT reviews the ENF, has meetings with the proponent as need be, issues a letter under my signature that suggests to the Secretary of EOEA what we believe should be scoped for the DEIR. The DEIR gets scoped. We meet with the applicant as they are drafting the DEIR to talk about our issues. Typically our issues are limited to state highway system, public transit system, bicycle ped amenities, and local roadway system. So we go through a negotiated process, we talk to them, we meet with them as often as need be. They then file their DEIR. We review their DEIR, we issue
What's the D for?
D draft.
Draft.
So there's a draft, there's an environmental notification form which basically lays out the grand parameters. Then you get a scope that says this is what you need to look at after we've submitted our letters of comment to the Secretary of the OEA. They go off and do a draft environmental impact report. Then we review the draft, we make comments on the draft to proceed to final. They address those comments in final, assuming they've done a good job. The Secretary issues them a certificate, and then, for my purposes, the last thing they need is a permit from the DOT. So our permit relates to access to the state highway system. So it will have requirements in it about all the mitigation we need in order for us to allow access to the state highway system. We will, while we comment on local roadways, we will not require any specific mitigation on a local roadway. Our permit will say, we suggest this intersection is going to be impacted. We suggest you work with this town on that intersection. And that is how the process generally works. Now, for casino specific, we have a protocol. So applicants who have not yet paid their $400,000 application fee are allowed one meeting with all state agencies. There was only, I believe, one applicant who took advantage of that so far. That was Ameristar. They've since, I believe, dropped out. The only agency they wanted to meet with was DOT. We met with them. After you filed your $400,000, you get as many meetings with the agencies as you need. So we have met with MGM once. We've met with Suffolk probably somewhere with Caesars Suffolk, somewhere between half a dozen and a dozen times. And that is an ongoing process as they're preparing their E and F.
They're preparing their ENF.
They are
Okay.
preparing their E and F for, I believe, filing sometime at the end of this month.
And in other memoranda and conversations that we've had, I believe, John, your recommendation was that the requirement for applications for Phase 2 was the ENF filed, or at least drafted and submitted. However, significant work goes afterwards in order to submit the DEIR. Could either of you speak a little bit as to design changes? How much design changes are then, as a result of what gets studied? And how can that jive with the commission's and the host community agreement, which would be predicated on some design assumptions?
I'll just talk about what happens generally with some of the more large projects that come in, and often large public works projects that come in, which is that they will file an ENF on a project, and then and we'll scope that. And what MIPA needs is to see alternatives. One of the basic premises of MIPA is that you need to seek the least damaging project. So proponents will come in, I'm just making this up, with 3 alternatives. And they will be, depending on the project, wildly different or not quite so different. And then the idea is that coming in with the draft, they will show all those alternatives that they have examined and the various impacts with them, and they will choose their preferred alternative. The secretary, should the secretary say, yes, you've done all the appropriate thing, that in fact does look like the appropriate preferred alternative, or certainly you could proceed to your final environmental impact report. And at that point, the proponent is only looking at that project that has that alternative. Now, from a MIPA perspective, when you talk about design, we're still talking about broad parameters. Even when we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions and efficient buildings, we're still looking at envelopes as opposed to what it may actually look like. And with that, I'll turn.
Right. So for my purposes, I'll just talk about casinos. Some of the casinos have gone out publicly and talked about infrastructure improvements. Many of those infrastructure improvements are on the state highway system. So my expectation is that the ANF will be filed with a specific alternative. We will then comment on that alternative and probably request additional alternatives. We may also expand the scope of the traffic study. So, for example, I know the Wampanoags are sort of not in the process, but they did file an ENF, and we did comment on their ENF, and we expanded their traffic study, and they are out preparing their DEIR. As part of that, they will bring in additional alternatives that we will then talk about. We will also talk about the timing of the project. So many of the casinos, I think, want to open in phases, and so they will propose, here's my total infrastructure package, here's what I think I need in order to open my first phase. We'll have all sorts of discussions about whether the total package is the correct package and whether the phase is enough for the first phase as defined.
But, so what if somebody follows one alternative and studies 3, but the preferred, from a technical standpoint, there's one alternative that's preferred. And let's just assume that that's part of a host community agreement. But further along the way, additional studies, an additional intersection that was studied because you thought needed additional scope, results in alternative B being more beneficial, more economical, or more feasible. I guess this is a question for us, not necessarily you. But what happens then?
Right, so let me tell you what may happen,
Yeah.
and what potentially the commission could consider. So what may happen with some of these applicants is that the applicants in their host community agreements may include a provision that would essentially act as a reopener.
Oh.
So the provision would state if indeed the infrastructure or whatever it is included in the host community agreement is amended from time to time after this agreement, then the parties shall get back and have provisions on how that would be indeed amended or dealt with pursuant to the host community agreement. So that may happen with certain host community agreements. What the commission could potentially do is, because all of these agreements are subject to the review of the commission could retain its ability to condition a license upon a revision of a host community agreement. So if indeed the host community agreement does not reflect reality, in the conditional phase, post-licensure, potentially the commission could retain its ability to then award as a condition of the applicant that they revise the host community agreement to reflect current conditions as they are known since the permitting process has been extended.
I have a take on, I think, on the same question that certainly has been troubling me. We've been, on the one hand, clear that we're not going to require the full permitting, and we tried to be respectful of the fact that there'll be many applicants, a lot of money would need to be spent for the permitting, a lot of time on the state side and so forth, so we've been clear that we are not going to make that mandatory. On the other hand, there is, as you've been discussing, the host community agreement, and that will have been approved by a referendum, which will refer to the terms of that host community agreement. And we will be for people who are not very far down the line, only have submitted their ENF, we will be submitting conditional permits. Is there a meaningful place in the process, in the permitting process, that you could articulate that would mean if a bidder gets there, that the chances of deal breakers are really de minimis? So as a practical matter, you're pretty sure that the big deal breakers, the ones that might, for example, turn an HCA upside down, or might change the commission's view about, the viability or appeal of a proposal. Is there some place where you can reduce that? Could we advise the bidders to say, we've required an ENF, but you are well advised to get to point X, because we will all know that by that point, you're pretty likely to be clean? Is that an understandable question?
I think it's an understandable question. And the MEPA regs clearly envision that people can get conditional permits and conditional licenses, as long as those conditional licenses make it clear that those permits or licenses would only be effective having complied with MEPA. I don't see how, given the MEPA regulatory structure, we would ever be able to say, just surrounding people, I just don't think we'd ever be able to say that. The permitting process is the permitting process. And unless that is changed to allow that type of green light, for lack of a better word, I don't see that I would be able to say we will ever be able to give you that type of indication. The process is the process. You need to do these things, and we need to say, because you don't know. I mean, it could turn out that you run into, this isn't likely, a sole source aquifer that you didn't know was there, or an Indian burial ground. I don't believe that it is possible, certainly from a MEPA standpoint, for us to say, to bless one proponent over another when it comes to the process that has been laid out.
Yeah, now, I 100% agree. But it's also true that we conduct the MEPA process in the public, and we're very frank and forthright as an agency about our opinion of infrastructure that people file. So to the extent, if someone files a infrastructure as part of their MEPA filing that we believe is a non-starter, whether it's in the host agreement or not in the host agreement, it's fairly easy to tell from what we say. I mean, there's not, we're never going to file a letter that says, what, are you crazy, you can't build this? But if people pay attention and people keep in tune to the MIPA process, there are ways that people can know in advance that well, you know what, they told us they were going to build, it doesn't look like they can build. And then the host community theoretically would very quickly get back in touch with the applicant and say, it doesn't look like you're going to be able to build this. What's happening in your MIPA process?
And part of this process is designed, host community X meets with us, we give them the benefit of this frank discussion regardless of where they are in the MIPA process. And so at that point, based on the conversations on whatever information that we have available, communities would be well advised to listen to the advice that they're receiving. And if there are, very, very specific questions about particular pieces of infrastructure, they'd be well advised to listen to what the agency has had to say. Again, at their own risk, if indeed they do not listen and they proceed with a host community agreement with some of these unanswered questions, there is the risk that after the process fully informs itself, then potentially a host community agreement could be then asked to be revised. But once again, some applicants certainly understand how the MIPA, I would assume actually most applicants understand how the MIPA process works and how interactions with DOT work. So I think that there's a full realization that things will change through the process. So I hope that this is not as much of an issue as I think that it is today. But we're doing everything that we can within the construct that we think is possible to alleviate some of those potential issues or to reduce the potential of those issues happening. But again, that's a very realistic possibility that things may have to change in the future.
But the bottom line, as I understand it, is that it's unlikely that the MIPA process can be completed by the time we're considering the Phase 2 application,
Yes.
number one. And number two, even if it were completed, that's not a green light, a guarantee, or anything more than a thoughtful assessment at the moment of the likelihood that the plan that's submitted to us is capable of execution. And that determination, whether the plan is in fact capable of execution, may take some years or some significant period of time, let's not put years on, some significant period of time after we award the license. Is that a fair summary?
Maeve say that, but obviously after the MIPA process, there is the permitting process within each of the agencies, and that can take time. And there could be other things that are identified besides the MIPA criteria.
Right, and that's why I put in that last
Right.
qualifying clause. So
Exactly.
you have the MIPA process. The MIPA process is a thoughtful analysis, but not a guarantee. And then there's the permitting process that has to follow the MIPA process. And then there's the on-the-ground execution, which may yield things that nobody saw before. I mean, that's always a possibility. But insofar as the upfront permitting is concerned, those are the three stages that we face, and we're going to be likely faced with the decision as to whether to issue a license before the MIPA process is finished.
A conditional license.
Conditional
A conditional
license.
license, yeah.
Right.
Yes, that's fair. I will say, as at the very beginning, MIPA does bring everyone together and bring
Right.
those
Right.
agencies together.
Right.
So it's not as if an agency will receive an application from,
Right.
one of these
Right.
resorts and say, oh,
Right.
I've never seen this before.
Right.
And that is where we can be helpful in terms of, but from a regulatory standpoint, you're absolutely correct.
Okay. And there is a focus on shovels in the ground. And the shovels in the ground comes after the license, and it comes after the permits.
Yes.
And that's something that everybody needs to be aware of,
Yes.
us included.
Now, for our purposes, we strongly encourage applicants to, the last step in the MIPA process for our purposes should be a letter of commitment. We've gone through the whole MIPA process. They're getting ready to file their final EIR. We've agreed about what the infrastructure should be. we like the final EIR to be filed with a commitment letter that says, yes, in consideration of you giving me this permit, MassDOT, this is what I will build. And then if that's actually taken place, our issuing of a permit is relatively quick. MIPA's done, but they publicly committed to what they're gonna do. We write up a permit that reflects the public commitment, and then we're done. Subject to them not finding something in the ground when they build it.
Right.
I think it goes without saying that because of the sheer size of these facilities, that everybody's going to go to an EIR.
It's hard to imagine that,
Be it traffic volume or
yes.
Yes.
utility usage or resource usage or
Yes.
just sheer size. Okay. Obviously, I think the message we need to convey also to the potential applicants is, John, I think you pointed out in your memo, as much information as can go into the draft ENF, or expanded ENF, I think is the appropriate title, helps keep moving the process along. So, don't skimp on the information that's going in the ENF, full well knowing, well, I got to do a full EIR at some point, so I'll just get through what I need to get through. Because you may come back with the ENF certificate, which, depending on how much information you've got from an applicant, is either going to be really detailed in what the next steps are, or is going to be, a telephone book of what is going to be needed in the next step. And I think that's something for us to consider in terms of the ENF certificate essentially gives us a good idea of what really is going to be incumbent upon the developer and the municipality and the state to get this through to fruition. So just being mindful of us just having the ENF certificate in hand really shouldn't only be it, it's actually what the content of that ENF
Exactly, yep.
certificate is.
Is there a definition of expanded ENF? That was in your
Yeah,
memo.
can I touch upon that?
Yeah.
And I'll let Nate. So what we are asking is the filing of an ENF, but we are asking for the robust filing of an ENF with information that could be similar to the type of information that would be provided under the expanded ENF definition of MIPA. But, but because we don't believe that many of these applicants will be able to achieve a single EIR at the end of the information that they've provided in the ENF, we don't believe that it is appropriate to say that we're requiring the expanded ENF filing pursuant to the regulations, but why don't I let
I just, when John mentioned to me, certainly an expanded ENF is going to be more robust than your standard ENF filing. Under MIPA, because it is proponent-driven, we give proponents the option of filing what is called an expanded environmental notification form. That is often, if not always, done for specific reasons under our regs, one of which is that they want a phase 1 waiver. So they want to proceed with a certain portion of their project before the completion of the entire MIPA process, before the completion of the draft environmental impact report or the final environmental impact report. There are requirements on us if you can get a waiver or not, one of which is that all of your infrastructure has to be there. So that's what.
Excuse me, by be there, you mean it has to be?
It has to exist.
It has
The phase 1 itself, right.
Physically exist.
Right. Because the whole, the idea of a phase 1 waiver is that this would be a terrible hardship to make you wait to look at the entire thing when you have, say, a building or one portion of the project that could proceed without any major infrastructure work. The other reason that proponents decide to file an expanded notification form is when they are seeking a single environmental impact report, which the Secretary has the ability to grant. The way we look at that is that the expanded should, in order for the single environmental impact report to be granted, the ability to file that, the expanded environmental notification has to stand in the way of a draft environmental impact report. So that requires discussion, again, a lot of this discussion that goes on before filing. Because if you haven't been scoped for your draft environmental impact report, you're making assumptions on filing your expanded environmental notification form that it would stand in the place of a draft environmental impact report. And I know that sounds so bureaucratic, but that's what the regs are.
Can I ask
Is that-
a question on a comment from MAPC that we received, just on that point? Because they state that MAPC agrees or suggests that filing an expanded ENF for a single EIR should not be required.
Well, I don't think you,
And
I
we are
mean,
not requiring
my point is, I don't believe that you can require it.
It's your process essentially.
Right, and we never require that someone do that. That is the determination of the proponent, for whatever reason, that they would like, and it's, again, as John has said, it's a risk on the proponent that they're going to give us the appropriate information, and the secretary would either grant the phase one or the ability to do a single. And many times, not many, but we have said no to getting a phase one waiver, and we have said no to people who have requested single.
Single.
Right.
And it, just to be blunt, it's highly unlikely that any of the casinos that are proposed today would get a phase one waiver or a single EIR,
Okay.
even if they file an expanded notification form. So I think what we're sort of dancing around is, they should file as much information as they can
Right.
possibly can.
In an ENF.
But they shouldn't bother calling in an expanded notification
Right.
form, because they're really, at the end of the day, not going to get a phase one waiver, and they're not going to get a single EIR.
Right. But you make that determination ultimately, or the secretary.
The secretary
Yeah.
Dave doesn't make that determination.
You, I'm sorry. You may.
You may.
Well, let's just make it. Thank you.
But I mean, the message is pretty clear. I mean, providing more and more into the ENF helps both of us, both the developer and us as a commission in partnership with the state permitting agencies, to hopefully move this process along faster and have the mitigation impacts, you know, more evident to all of us.
Assuming it's good information and the type of information we actually want, so that, the fact that you provide a lot of information, if it's, I can't think of a word I'd like to use, so I'll just say crap, it doesn't do you any good, right?
Right.
You need to file good information, and if you can file good information, you should file as much as you can. But if you're filing a bad traffic study with bad trip generation numbers, it doesn't matter that you spent a lot of money and a lot of time doing it. Not me. The DOT is going to ask EEA to make you redo it.
Is there anything that we can do to clarify what good information means? Is that something that's common knowledge? Or is there anything that we could be proactive in saying, here's the kind of information that is really constructive, useful?
I think there's two things. First, for developments of this size, 99.9% of them are using consultants who know what good information is.
Right.
Number two is under the protocol, we're ready, willing, happy, and able to meet with people to talk about that before they file their ENF.
Right.
So, you know, people should be taking advantage of the procedures you guys developed with the secretaries. They should be coming in and meeting with us. We should be discussing things. You know, none of us want to delay this process.
And part of the message that I take to applicants is that they should avail themselves of these resources now as soon as possible,
And as soon as-
especially after the 15th.
As soon as we know on the 15th who's definitely in.
Yes.
It seemed like a very aggressive outreach on your part, saying.
That's right.
You got to get in there ASAP is good. I mean, because that's in everybody's interest in the long run.
I'm somewhat surprised, I guess, by the fact that we have had only so few applicants actually.
So only
come in
those
and
two?
visit with you.
Well,
Only,
so outside of this process, we've met with the Wampanoags,
Yeah,
okay? And I forgot, we met with Plain Ridge.
okay.
So we met with Plain Ridge,
Okay.
we met with them once, we went with Ameristar once, they weren't an applicant, they were under the protocol. We've met with MGM once so far, more meetings to follow, and we've met with Suffolk 6 to a dozen times, and are probably getting close to being where we'll start setting up a regular standing meeting with them, I think.
John, when we had the meeting with the secretaries, we were talking about, and this was kind of pursuant to our original conversation, post-licensing, was there anything we could do to work together to have an expedited permitting process? And there was some talk, and then Secretary Bielecki said, something like, if you're not gonna have a completed MEPA process, there won't be an expedited process. Remember that?
Yes.
It sounded like there was a mirror of that. If you do have the completed MEPA process, there is some kind of expedited process that could be executed. Is that a particular process? Is that something that we should know we've got teed up as soon as MEPA's done, or is it something we need to broadcast to people, or?
I think what the Secretary was saying was that he was using shorthand, expedited was shorthand for quick.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
if indeed
Okay.
you haven't progressed through MEPA, you probably shouldn't expect that your permitting is going to be done in a month.
Okay, okay.
But
So
if you have progressed through MEPA, that's what he means by expediting. But I
Okay.
think we're using expedited process in a different form, as in our expedited process, that we are going to make the time that it takes shorter, and so we're going to expedite it, rather than, when he says
Okay.
it's not expedited, he just means that it's not likely to be 10
It wasn't
days.
like a formal process that
No.
sits under chapter XYZ that says,
No.
under certain circumstances, you can bypass, yeah, okay.
No, I think he was just
Yeah, okay.
trying to make, and everybody should know that they have to be realistic, because we are not requiring substantial movement through MEPA and the permitting process, that permitting will take time afterwards. And we're gonna do everything that we can to make it go shorter,
Right.
but it just takes time, and I hope people know that.
Well, this is, excuse me, Commissioner,
Go
this
ahead.
this is one thing I do want to make sure that we really are aggressive on. That's why we're having this conversation, because many of the applicants are in the room. But we want people to realize, yes, we respect that you don't want to spend all your money up front because you don't know if you're going to get the license. We appreciate that. But the price that you'll pay is on the other end, when the construction trades will be talking to you, not us anymore, about getting going. And so I just think we need to be as really clear and make sure that we've really set expectations, not only to the bidders, but to the public too, and to the local communities and everybody else, that if a bidder chooses to save their money, which is fine, there is a price to be paid on the other end.
Just a quick question, Mae. You mentioned, I think you mentioned, having a pretty good turnaround time for getting a ENF certificate out.
It's very good.
I have no doubt. Are there any other timelines confined in your
We have
process?
timelines in every part of the MEPA process. So the ENF comes in, every document comes into us. Its public comment period clock starts running when it's noticed in the environmental monitor. Then we take public comment on the ENF, and the secretary has 7 to 10 days to make his determination and write his scope. And under the regs, he either writes his scope or he says, you're fine, you've given us enough. That is not going to be these projects.
Right.
So the secretary writes his scope, and again, then the proponents go out and do all their work. They file the draft environmental impact report with us. That also then gets noticed in the environmental monitor. That gets a 30-day comment period, and the secretary has 7 days to write his certificate. We always take all 7 days. And then the same happens with the final.
But for the ENF phase, I give you my ENF today.
It's
average
30 to
turnaround
40 days. Well, sometimes extensions will be granted. The secretary cannot just make an extension. The proponent has to ask for an extension to the public comment period, which we grant generally, unless they're asking for a huge extension. And then we say, why don't you just take your ENF away and come back.
Sometimes they ask for extensions because the reviewing agencies ask them to. Okay? They give us a ton of information, it takes us a long time. We work with them and say, could you ask for a week extension because it's going to take us an extra week to get our comments together.
Okay.
And generally speaking, most of them are compliant when we ask.
Okay.
But we can't ask, they have to ask on our behalf because it's their process, not ours.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, could I go through some of the comments that we received today? That'll include some of the comments that we received previously and then over this last week. Comments that we received prior to this document being out for public review Shefsky from Springfield said that applicants should not be required to obtain or have progressed substantially towards state, federal, and local permitting. They should be able to provide reasonable assurances to the MGC through due diligence regarding issues of permitting. The MAPC recommended previously that the requirement that we should have is the ENF certification standard. MGM noted that it is typical in RFPs that no substantial permitting is initiated prior to the time of a conditional award. The investment is significant. It recommends asking applicants to explain what is necessary and the timeline for permitting. They also recommend that substantial conversations with the agency should occur prior to the time of award. Martha Robinson suggests that all such permitting should be completed prior to the RFA2. DLA Piper on behalf of Suffolk. These are new comments that we've received in the last week. They support the recommendation that was proposed last week. A higher level of detail in such documents, the documents we're talking about, the ENF documents, that gives valuable information for the commission, state agencies, and communities to review. MAPC, they reiterated their prior recommendation regarding the ENF certificate, and they agreed that an expanded ENF is not an appropriate requirement. They state that the MGC should have a condition in its licenses that the MGC and other state agencies have the ability to reopen negotiations between host and surrounding community agreements in order to include mitigation of any impacts identified in the MIPA process and in the RFA2 application. The MMA said that they support the recommendation that we not set specific requirements on local licensing. However, they disagree with the requirement that applicants demonstrate consistency with local zoning. They state that a one-size-fits-all requirement may have an unnecessary adverse impact on developments that are proceeding on an appropriate timeline.
I didn't get that. What was that?
Local zoning is something.
They said, well, your suggestion was that we do have to have some indication of zoning approval.
Yes.
Because zoning requires oftentimes more than a referendum majority.
Yes.
But what was this objection or point?
So they say that a one-size-fits-all requirement may have an unnecessary adverse impact on developments that are proceeding on an appropriate timeline. I think this supports their consistent support of the home rule and support of local communities having the flexibility to do what they need to in their own environments.
Who was that who submitted that?
That was the Mass Municipal Association.
But your recommendation on the zoning is not necessarily one of requiring, but rather some intelligence as to whether the applicant and the host community believes that there will not necessarily be a zoning fiasco, let's say.
My recommendation is for the whole host of municipal permits that we not have any specific requirement that they proceed in local permitting as part of our application process, with the one exception that they do have to demonstrate consistency with local zoning prior to the time of the award of the conditional license, not necessarily prior to the time of the application. So that would give communities probably an extra couple of months after the submission of their applications to demonstrate that they have achieved consistency with local zoning because of the supermajority requirements and the risk.
Right, but your recommendation towards consistency with local zoning is not necessarily antagonistic with MMA's point about one size fits all. I mean, it would be consistency with whatever the local zoning or requirements are.
I think
Is that
that's
a
a good point
fair
in some
statement?
regards. And one of my recommendations is that even though as a policy matter, that we continue to say that we should demonstrate consistency with local zoning. I think as we go forward in the regulation process, how a community would actually demonstrate that consistency, that should be further refined as part of our regulations. There are different options that communities could utilize, such as an opinion of council on local zoning consistency. They could demonstrate that they have actually significantly amended their local zoning. You have other situations where, for example, like the Boston process, it is not actually subject to the same statutory supermajority requirement, but I understand that they also have a supermajority requirement that would require some other further intricacy on how we demonstrate consistency with local zoning. So to your point, our our advisory would still take into account some local circumstances,
Right.
potentially through the process, but because of the dangers of not having zoning in place prior to the time of award, I think, respectful to our colleagues at MMA, I just think that's probably too dangerous a situation for the commission and for applicants.
Right.
Outside of zoning, do you see any other permitting differences between any of the possible host municipalities?
I mean, each of them, approach local zoning in different ways and permitting in different ways. Some may be 43D communities already. The law requires that they either be a 43D community, which is expedited local permitting, or that they have a 43D process for local permitting. And some may already be in that situation. They may be in a designated 43D zone, but some may require that they set up these structures. And basically what would be required is the local community would establish a permitting ombudsman that would then work with all the relevant local authorities in issuing permits through the local process. So they each are different, but they'll be approaching many of the same issues.
Anything that you would sense beyond zoning that could potentially slow a project down?
Well, just design approvals. There are many different things at the local level that could trip any project.
Historical commissions.
Yeah, Conservation Commission approvals, which would then be subject to, state processes. But there are many different things that a project can be tripped up on at a local level. But I think the general thought is if the community has indicated its support through a referendum of this, and the governing bodies of these municipalities have also indicated their support, that they will work with all their local bodies to try to find a way to go through the permitting process, regardless of those obstacles. But again, the permitting there's no guarantee in permitting. Finally, the Foley HOAG, on behalf of Mohegan Sun, they support the recommendation. If they say otherwise, many state agencies would have to spend very valuable time reviewing applications of projects that may not be ultimately approved by the commission. Similarly, municipal departments would also be required to spend significant time and resources to evaluate proposals. They also support the recommendation of the commission and the agencies to develop an advisory program to inform communities. And those are the comments that we've received.
So your proposal stays on the table, we're not voting on it today, or are we?
I would think that you could vote on that proposal.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, because we've talked about it now for a week and had an extra.
Yep.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments, Mr. McHugh?
No, I think that this has been an enormously helpful discussion, both to us and to applicants who probably are familiar with this, and to others who are watching the progress. And the success of the speed with which we can actually proceed to a shovel in the ground stage depends not only on our moving as quickly as we responsibly can, but also coordinating with the other agencies and with the energy that the applicant puts into the filings designed to give the agencies the information they need in order to make their the decisions for which they're responsible. So it's a network of decision-making and teamwork and coordination that's got a great foundation here that we need to make sure works well and continue to tinker with if we run into bumps, and both on our side and through the ombudsman to the applicants in the cities and towns to make this thing work as quickly as we responsibly can.
Yeah, I agree. And I will say, just for the record, the governor's office and the executive branch representatives have been very clear that they take the governor's priority, that this is something that they want to move as quickly as they possibly can, and clearly are going to do everything possible, like us, within responsible parameters to move this along, and we appreciate that. Somebody want to put that into a form of a motion?
I sure can.
Okay.
I move that we accept the recommendations from Ombudsman Siemba to relative to requiring the filing of an ENF, but not requiring further processes in the MIPA process as part of our application for phase 2.
What is the, what question number is it?
12.
Question 12.
12, yeah. So maybe it's recommend, to accept the recommendation
Sure.
pursuant to the question of 12.
12.
As contained in his written memorandum.
In his, yeah.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
That recommendation 12 is part of the record of the last meeting, and that has a number of
That's all the
subparts
nuances,
that-
yes.
Right, so-
Yep.
Right.
Thank you.
So packaging it around 12, right? Second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Maeve and Dave. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, John, you're going to stay up here, and are you going to come back and do this, or are you going to leave us in the lurch?
He didn't hear you, Mr. Chair.
John?
Comes back.
I think Todd is also part of.
Right. So we've got the community disbursement issue and the surrounding communities questions, right?
I think what we have, the surrounding community issue is slightly tied to the community disbursement
Okay.
issue, but if I get rejoined by Mr. Grossman. So what we'd like to do is just provide you some further information of where we are with the grant agreement. As I've reported previously, we've been working on the grant agreement. We've been talking to the Department of.
Just to be clear for the public, this is the ability to access some of the $400,000 deposit, non-refundable deposit, not less than $50,000, which is to go to the communities for the sake of planning for community mitigation. That's the disbursement that we're talking about.
That's right.
Okay.
And we've been working with the Department of Revenue, Division of Local Services, in order to address any sort of municipal finance concerns, specifically with communities that are not allowed to spend monies outside of a local appropriation, but they are allowed to proceed with grants that are provided by the state. Our grant would be very similar to grants that are provided throughout the range of state government. So we are likely to have the grant agreement before you next week, together with a memo of how communities can take advantage of the grants. This will dovetail with the receipt of the applications next week as well. There are a couple issues that we'd like to talk to you about, and I'll let Mr. Grossman take over in a second, but two issues. One item related to what funds can be utilized for, involving issues of reimbursement. There's certain questions under the regulation, but we think a common sense reading is that we can utilize these funds to reimburse communities for costs. And then the second issue relates to something that we would like to present to the commission next week of what funds can be utilized for and what communities can receive these funds. Technically, there are no surrounding communities yet. Surrounding communities pursuant to the regulation and pursuant to the statute are defined as surrounding communities that are included in an application that is submitted before the commission. So if an applicant goes out and reaches an agreement with a community and submits that as part of their application, they are deemed a surrounding community pursuant to the regulations. However, since we are in the pre-RFA2 application process, they do not have the benefit of that designation. So we would like to recommend that communities that are not specifically a surrounding community could still take advantage of technical assistance funds, regardless of the nicety of that declaration of surrounding community status. And why we are recommending that is because we would like to make sure that applicants are encouraged to provide technical assistance to communities that may be experiencing impacts, regardless of whether or not they may eventually find their way to the commission as part of an application that is submitted by them. So some communities may be experiencing impacts, but perhaps those impacts don't rise to the level whereby they would be deemed a surrounding community by the definition that we define in our regulations that'll be promulgated later this year. But still, it might be in the best interest of both the applicant and that particular impacted community to have some funds available to evaluate impacts. And by evaluating those impacts, perhaps some of the concerns might be alleviated, or there just might be a more realistic understanding of what those impacts may be. Currently, under our standards, if one were to receive a grant of technical assistance, potentially there's a question of whether or not by receipt of those funds, does one actually automatically become a surrounding community for the purposes of our application? And if you receive funds and you're designated as a surrounding community, does that mean that the applicant has to sign a full impact agreement with that community? We don't believe that that really was what was intended, and we would like to enable both applicants and impacted communities to fully understand what those impacts may be without a fear by an applicant or by parties that by providing technical assistance funding that you might automatically become a surrounding community for the purposes of the full application and the attendant rights.
So the early money ought to be is designed to give you basically to give you the tools to figure out whether you're going to be a surrounding community.
Correct.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So the primary issue right now is that the law provides for these monies to be designated to the municipalities. We need to come up with a mechanism to get it there. And that's what we are going to develop. We've been working with Commissioner Zuniga, and I've been working with John as well, and in conjunction with DOR to come up with a protocol that will satisfy municipal finance laws as well as our own statutes, and provide a clear manner in which the funds can be provided. Essentially, there'll be two ways. You can either do it by way of straight reimbursement, in which a municipality expends appropriated funds for these designated purposes, and we reimburse them for those upon a determination that they meet the requirements of our statute and our regulations. Or secondly, that we provide them with what they refer to as a gift grant, which is a mechanism by which municipalities can receive funds that are unappropriated and spend them. So we just need to detail who will be eligible for these funds, how they will apply for them, and what decision making goes into us distributing the funds. And as John mentioned, we have drafted a grant agreement that should be ready for your review shortly. We're also in the process of putting together an advisory that we intend to have DOR take a look at first to make sure that they are in agreement with it as well. And they have preliminarily agreed to enter or issue some type of advisory as well to municipalities as to how to deal with these monies. So this is just kind of a preview of what I think you'll be hearing, whether it's next week or the week after, depending on how quickly we can have this all tied up. But we're very close to, I think, having this process in place.
Do you have, informally, do you have the process by which you'll vet proposal? I mean, basically the question is going to be, how do we know who gets how much?
Right.
For what is not a finite resource, but it's got to be a resource that we deal with carefully. So how do you anticipate doing that?
Well, I think the commission, to some degree, has envisioned this process already. And in it's section 114.03, the community disbursement section of the regulation, it references letters of authorization. And this is what we'll have to flesh out in the advisories, of course, subject to the review of the commission, whereby a applicant discusses the specific needs of the municipality with the municipality and essentially signs off on it and presents it to us. So that would be the trigger that we would look at. So our review may be, in some respects, perfunctory. We get this letter of authorization, we say, yep, that's okay, here you go. The issue that we'll have to address will be what happens if the applicant refuses to sign off on certain things, and we think that they're legitimate expenses. But we can, I think, get to that point once we've had a chance to put some language together.
Okay, I'd forgotten that. We talked about this before, that if they could decide, we should be happy with it, right? If they can agree, we should be happy with it, yeah. Okay.
And even option 2, the gift grant that you described, will, which is something that will be part of the agreement. The commission will retain the ability, not necessarily exercise it, but will retain the ability to audit if we chose records, etc. Given that this effectively is a grant that goes up front at times.
You know, I think this is something that I think we've talked about, but we have the ability, if the 400,000 is insufficient for the background check, we have the authority to assess further expenses on the bidder. If the 50,000 goes to 100, and therefore the 400 isn't enough, are we clear that we have the authority to assess them for further community mitigation studies? Is that clear in there too?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's how our regs are written, that they, if you need further community disbursements, then that is added to the total.
Okay.
And the statute's clear on that point as well.
Statute is.
Was it clear? Okay, I didn't remember that. Okay, good. What, you want to segue into surrounding communities, or where are you going with that proposal?
No, the surrounding communities was only mentioned in respect to the fact that we would like to provide additional technical assistance and flexibility so that the full surrounding communities would be.
Okay.
And then I submitted earlier this week my draft of surrounding communities regulation.
Right.
And that's, I plan to bring that to the commission next week. And what my hope is that that regulation will then be submitted far and wide for comment.
Okay.
Before the commission votes on that.
Okay, so it's more than, it's your answer to question 1.
Yeah.
Right, as well as you proposed a reg.
Well, what I submitted to was just the reg, which was based on my previous recommendation regarding surrounding community.
Okay.
Recommendation
Okay.
1, I took that recommendation and boiled it down into the form of a regulation.
Okay, so, but this is for next week to consider.
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't think that's actually part of the public
Okay.
document.
Okay, fine. I think that's it. Yep, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Item 4, yeah, Director Driscoll, I thought you might want to, pardon?
I'm Glovsky.
Driscoll, whatever, yeah, Driscoll, Glovsky. You might want to introduce our externs.
Yes, I would very much like to. We have 2 externs from MIT working with us during independent activity period. If you guys want to stand up in the background, we have Jamila Smith-Dell, who's working with me on looking at technology in the gaming sector, and Anthony Yu is working with the racing division on allocations of funds. Director Durenberger can discuss that a little bit more. They've been with us just since Monday, and they're really doing spectacular work. We're really thrilled to have them here. Thank you.
You should know that your praises are already being sung. People are saying, wow, it's so great to have these guys. They're so smart and cooperative, so thank you very much.
And given how busy we all are, having people who are motivated and inner-directed, and you can hand them a task and go off and do it, it really is a thrill to work with them.
Yeah, it's great. So thank you, you guys. Great. Okay, I don't think there's much really to look at on the chart. I just think we maybe scroll up just a little bit, Eileen.
Scroll down.
Yeah, well, yeah. We are talking now, we're about to finish the background. The applications, everybody knows, are due on the 15th. On the 15th, or a day or two thereafter, we'll have a comprehensive list of who are for sure in the game. We are working on moving this process as fast as we possibly can. We'll talk more about this when we get to the IEB report, but we're working with our Investigations and Enforcement Bureau and our consultants to streamline this background process as much as we possibly can. We have decided to hone in on the slots applications, assuming we get all the information from the various slot applicants. Try to get that done quickly, maybe even quicker than we have it here on the chart. In parallel, we need to make sure that the drafting of the regs, the drafting of the regs for the application process is, in particular, is done in time to start the application, the RFA2 process when the background checks are done. So the same thing is happening here, that we're going through this entire process. I think we talked last week about, on the chart, the regs is a 3-month process for RFA2. It was a 2-month process for RFA1. We think we can save some time in here, and Attorney Glovsky and the others, the consultants, are working on this. I'm sorry, Attorney Grossman, having a hard day today. So anyway, but we're really in the guts of our work right now, and when we get, we've been talking about having, I think we've said we have 11 people, organizations in process. It may be now a few more than that, but somewhere between 11 and 12, 13, 14 organizations we will be moving through this background check pipeline, as we are also moving as quickly as we can to get the RFA2 regs all ready to go. Meanwhile, there's a lot going on with the Racing Commission and so on and so forth, but this is really, I think, the guts of the process, and where we're hopeful that we can move the process along really expeditiously. I don't think there are any other material changes or issues other than things we'll talk about when we get to them on the agenda. Okay, thanks.
I had a couple other things that I just wanted to note. There has been some question about the application fee submittal. We're going to put some additional instructions on the website either later this evening or early tomorrow morning to facilitate that. So if any of the applicants have questions on that, they can look at that information. 2 procurements that we had out, one for equine testing, one for the research agenda, came in on Monday. We did have a good response. We're proceeding through phase 1 and hope to get to phase 2, which would be distributing the responses to the procurement teams probably tomorrow. I know on the research agenda we have a scoring meeting scheduled for next week, so we are going to be moving through that pretty quickly. And we hope to have the audit services procurement for racing posted tomorrow afternoon. And I think that's about all that I have, unless there are any questions from the commissioners.
Well, we've talked already a lot about the increasing need for cash management, record keeping, the 400,000, and now if we're talking about this process of dispersing the 50,000, that 50,000 could go to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different communities. So there's going to be a lot of paperwork processing, financial record keeping to.
Yes, and I am working with the comptrollers on setting up the sort of the independent budgets for each of the applications so that we can keep good track of that.
Right, and you have some personnel in the pipeline too, I think, to help, right? Okay, yeah. Then if we get that right now, we're fine. If we fall behind, we'll never catch up because it'll be so complicated. Okay, great. Thank you. Commissioner Zuniga, Employee Manual, Chapter 6.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've included a revised version of the last chapter in the manual, one that no longer contains the public records section, as that will be incorporated as part of another handout that I have here in the packet on Chapter 2. But just want to stay with Chapter 6. That would complete all of the chapters. This revision also includes your comments from last week. They have been incorporated here and clarified. So I can take any comments, and if there aren't any, I would move that the Commission adopts or votes on Employee Manual, Chapter 6.
I would just raise one small correction that I noticed. Under press relations, it says when the Director of the Communications is absent, that inquiries be referred to the Chair, but I think we should also include our Executive Director when the person comes on board at such a point.
That's easy enough.
So moved with that addition.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? Any other questions, issues? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? ayes have it.
So this completes
you.
now Commissioner Zuniga's excellent work on the handbook. We have a handbook. We have one more minor item, but basically the employee handbook's in place, so that's terrific.
This does, and it now begs the question of what I will be shortly moving to incorporate. Any additions or modifications to the manual or any other policies, I recommend that we then only vote on that addition or that modification, not necessarily the chapters or each of the chapters like we did, because we'll realize that this will be likely a living document. So in that venue, I have for you what Attorney Grossman drafted for us, which is an update, which would be an update to Section 2 of the manual that enhances the public records request policy. It's been submitted here for consideration. It effectively is a more detailed procedure than what we have currently, and it centralizes the response and handling of records with the legal department, as it was always the intention. I am just submitting this for the first time, so we could not vote and vote on it next week to conform with some of the procedures we said we would set for ourselves. Or take any questions if anybody has.
We really need to have, filling the void here, just to keep things rolling. We really need to, we really need to have a, we really need to have a centralized, uniform procedure for dealing with this. We've been dealing with these requests as best we can up to this point. The public's entitled to these documents, and the requests likely are going to increase as we move forward. So we need a uniform process for handling them and responding to them, and we need to have some body or some people who are trained in looking for exemptions and the like to make certain that we're not responding by delivering information that in fact is contains privacy implications for individuals and the like. So we need to develop a comprehensive plan and then train people to do this. And this is the first step for doing that.
Yeah, what I was thinking about during the void was whether we wanted to put any music at the beginning of this, because we have talked about it, and there are different public agencies respond in different ways, and some can wait as long as possible, and others respond promptly, and we've tried to establish a precedent of responding promptly, even though sometimes it's a pain. But I don't think there's any need to. I don't think there's any need to do that. What we say here clearly that we will respond as soon as practicable and within 10 days, and I don't think there's a need to add anything more than that. I mean, it is clearly our intent to, as part of being participatory, transparent, and fair, to respond as promptly as we possibly can to these things. They are occasionally abusive and excessive, and we need to look out for our own interests as well. But we do intend to be as forthcoming as we possibly can be on these. But I think that's fine. I think this is good. And this leaves up to the discretion of the legal department, basically, the method for assessing costs, right? So,
yes, but
and within the Secretary of State's parameters.
Within the Secretary of State's parameters, and our regulations talk about, I think they talk about, where's Todd, publishing a schedule of fees, and if they don't, we can certainly do that at some point, so that people know that what costs we're going to charge, if we charge costs. There may be situations where we waive them, so.
And we talked about this, I think Commissioner Zuniga and I talked about this, there was a draft that had fees in it, and I wasn't sure that draft conformed with so we can talk about that.
That's correct. That's now no longer in the employee manual. That was one of the updates that you had.
So where does this go in the employment?
This updates a section in Chapter 2.
Okay.
I forget the exact section, but it's maybe 214, something like that.
You know, the only thing I would say, I mean, I guess we need to adopt this, but as to the employee manual in general, and we've talked about this, but lots of times they get written and then they sit on the shelf and nobody even knows they exist. And it doesn't, we don't want to do that. So we want to
My
make.
intent is to, now that we've completed it, is to, over the next several weeks, send out a chapter a week to the employees.
Right.
And then ultimately, we'll set up an intranet and have it available to people and publish updates as appropriate.
Right, and I think we ought to package it, you know, I think we talked about this, having our vision, our mission statement ought to be at the front of it. There is some language at the front about what this means, and I think new employees ought to have some kind of, again, we've talked about this too, but some kind of orientation process where they get this and other stuff. Okay, somebody want to move on this with the adoption of?
I sure can. If there's no further questions, I move that the Commission adopt the public records request policy as presented and incorporate it as part of the procedures and policy manual.
Second?
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it. Yep.
There was one item that I was supposed to mention during my report that, after talking with our council, I should bring up. In regard to the MIPA process, there is a requirement under the MIPA regulations that entities that file for a state permit within 10 days after filing for a state permit, they have to file an ENF form. It was always anticipated that our license, which is a state permit under the state definition, that is at the RFA2 application. People cannot act on an RFA1 application, but in case any of our colleagues are scrambling to do the ENF form within 10 days, I was just hoping to recommend that we clarify that in our regulations, and I think that is the intent.
Right, right, it is. The RFA 2 is the application for purposes of filing the ENF form.
Right.
Sorry about that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, finance update. Is that the next one?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. I can speak to that, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, please do.
In your packets, there is a report. I've included a report, a budget to actual expenditure report, given that the second quarter ended December 31st, and the costs incurred on a cash basis as of that time are now incorporated in this report. The detailed report from Mars is the second page to the attachment. This represents all of fiscal year 13 expenses. And the summary report that I have here in the first page is a comparison against the budget. What I do in the second column is do a quick prorated budget. In this case, that would be half the amount of the budget, and compare that to the expenditures that I was just talking about to get a sense as to our rate of burn, if you will, or our rate of expenditures. Worthy of note is that because I report on a cash basis, there are costs that are incurred and not yet reflected because we abide by the Commonwealth terms for payment. And in many instances, it's within 45 days. Sometimes if there's prompt payment discounts, we take advantage of those, but in instances, it's 45 days. So on any given month, we are currently spending about 290,000 or 300,000 of non-salaries expenditures that would not be reflected here. So that figure of 2.4 million of expenditures is probably closer on an accrual basis to about 2.7 or 2.8 million, which is on track in my estimation to be within our approved budget at the end of the year.
Why don't we do this on, I'm sure we've talked about this, why don't we do it on an accrual basis? It's harder.
Once we get more staff, which
Okay,
we
fine.
are,
Okay, good.
we will be doing that.
Okay, good.
It requires encumbering
Right.
many of the expenditures and Director Glovsky and I are spread thin on other things, but we will.
Okay. Consequence of the current cash basis means that some of the expenditures here were actually FY12 expenses.
That is correct as well. Some of the expenditures here, notably from May and June of
Right.
2012,
Right.
hit 2013,
Right.
and are reflected here.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can take any questions or observations, or,
And we are, the statewide allocation percentage, we're not
yes.
going to have to do.
We're not. Since I keep it here because that was part of the budgeted amount, but since that budget, I confirmed that that is done in arrears on the 2 years prior. That's assessed of agencies in arrears. So we will begin noticing a statewide allocation percentage effectively a year from now.
But that's also something we can talk about with ANF.
That's correct.
About at some point we can discuss that, because it's not clear that was anticipated that we would pay that at all.
That's correct. That's correct.
We should remember to do that.
Yep. There's no other questions. This is not meant as a vote, of course. This is just meant as a report that we do periodically, because we are effectively the financial overseers of our own funds.
Okay. Was this your?
Yes, I have one last
Okay.
item as part of the finance update. We continue to grow and need additional space and some technical voice and data technology requirements. I'm presenting for your consideration a proposal to execute a contract with Future Technologies Group, FTG, to enhance and expound our voice and data technology. I've included that in this short memo. FTG is a state-approved vendor and part of the state vendor list, so its procurement is very straightforward, and this system will allow additional functionality that will be especially useful given that we have 2 and potentially 3 spaces within the same building.
Well, what's encompassed within the term data services? Is that transmission and receipt, or is it something else?
Well, it includes wiring that is now anticipated to be done, but also network services,
Okay.
our ability to access.
It's not software, it's not the
No.
Document management stuff, the
No.
filing, electronic filing, that kind of
No.
stuff. It's just
No.
the transmission and receipt infrastructure.
Yes.
Right.
It's our ability to connect to the web and be connected and get phoned over the web. We have voice over IP.
Right,
It's largely enhancing the phone system.
Right.
okay.
So
Okay.
if there's no further questions or comments, I would move that the Gaming Commission execute a contract with Future Technologies Group for $25,000 to enhance the voice and data services that the commission currently has.
Second?
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it.
Thank you.
We've got a couple of fairly big topics coming up. Let's take a 5-minute break, and we'll get back in a minute.
Thank you.
And we will go to item 5, the investigations and investigations and enforcement bureau report. Acting Director, Colonel Commissioner Cameron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have any more names for you at this present time. Scope of licensing, first of all of the interested parties who have requested scope of licensing meetings have had those meetings. All of our determination letters are out. There are some additional people who are asking questions, but we don't know at this late date whether or not they'll, A, choose to have a scope of licensing meeting, or B, submit an application, which they can do without that scope of licensing meeting. We do have some meetings. In fact, I'm going to have to leave here early today to go to 2 I'll call them clarification meetings. In other words, they sent us their information, which was requested, so we can determine in conjunction with our consultants who is required to qualify. Some of our potential applicants have further information slash questions about those letters, 2 of whom have requested meetings this afternoon. So in trying to do this before the deadline on Tuesday, we have a lot of last-minute questions, and we are being as accommodating as possible. Frankly, that's what we should do to make sure everyone has the correct information in moving forward in preparing their applications. Everyone is aware that the deadline is Tuesday. We do have 3 applications which have been submitted, 2 of which have been deemed substantially sufficient, so that they have now gone to our contract background investigations to begin those investigations. 1 is in the review process now. It will be completed by tomorrow, and if it is deemed sufficient, that will be shipped immediately for the beginning of a background. And a couple of the applicants have advised us that they will submit tomorrow, so we're anticipating those, and of course we're anticipating all of those by Tuesday who really are serious about going forth in the process. So we will be busy with investigations and determining the status of those applications. So that's my report for scope of licensing and investigations at this time. And now, sir, I'd like to move on to the IEB Director Search Update. I'd like to report that we have completed that search. We had 54 applicants in all, working in conjunction with the search firm, Jurastaff, 54 resumes and letters expressing an interest in the position. 8 of those applicants were interviewed informally. 4 then moved on to a formal interview with an interview panel comprised of law enforcement executives, including me. There was a unanimous decision by that panel to move 1 candidate forward before the full commission. I'm pleased to announce that we have that candidate here today. And I'd just like to briefly outline some of the attributes why I believe this is a superb candidate for the position of Investigations and Enforcement Bureau Director. That candidate, before I ask her to step forward and answer any of your questions, if I may say a few things, this candidate is presently the Undersecretary for Law Enforcement at the Massachusetts Executive Office of Public Safety, that is Karen Wells. Karen Wells comes to us as the nominee with a wealth of law enforcement experience, nearly 2 decades of experience, which includes investigating, prosecuting high-level criminal cases, narcotics, corruption, organized crime, and fraudulent schemes, to name a few. She also has regulatory experience overseeing regulatory agencies and a long-term relationship with the local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. I believe those three skill sets make her uniquely qualified for the position. Just to name a couple of the responsibilities over at the Department of Public Safety, has regulatory and licensing inspection experience with the Department of Public Safety. Ms. Wells directs the functions and administration of the Massachusetts State Police, and as well as municipal training experience. Also, she took the lead on gaming enforcement, gaming-related issues. She served as the secretary to lead those issues, so she's really, for the last couple of years, been taking the lead when it comes to all of the law enforcement partners with gaming-related issues. In fact, that's how I was first acquainted with Undersecretary Wells in her capacity there. Previous experience, she was a deputy chief of public protection, anti-terrorism, corruption, technology. This was all at the Middlesex District Attorney's Office, where she also prosecuted high-level narcotics and white-collar crimes. She was an assistant attorney general in the criminal bureau in the Massachusetts Attorney General's office, where she led special investigations and the narcotics division. She's a graduate of Boston University Law School and Colgate University. And, again, I think that those three skill sets, the prosecutorial, the regulatory, and the investigative skill sets, the relationships which are critical to this new endeavor, her relationships at the AG's office, with our federal partners, with our local partners, with the state police are invaluable to us. And the other thing I've come to know is that she really has the problem-solving skills as well as her collaborative work style, which I think, again, is equally as important as the experience, the ability to work collaboratively with our law enforcement partners, with the commission, with our applicants. I think those skill sets will make her, I'm proud to recommend her for this position, and I'd like to ask her to step up now and please answer some questions from the commission.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman,
Welcome.
members of the
Welcome, Ms.
commission.
Wells.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
You've heard Commissioner Cameron sing her praises.
And I don't do that easily, do I, Mr.
No,
Chair?
you sure don't. Would you sing my praises a little? Some of you have not met her at all, and I've had a chance to get to know her a little bit, but fire away.
I can volunteer to start asking. Very nice to meet you, Ms. Wells. I go back to when I first read the Gaming Act, when I was first applying to be a commissioner, and since then, and especially afterwards, in the Act, I've come to appreciate this notion of balance. There's a lot of competing priorities, if you will, in very broadly. And as I think of the Investigations and Enforcement Bureau, one in particular really is one that I would like you to speak and share your thoughts with us. For example, one in which we have this very heavy front-loaded activity relative to investigations, prior awards of licenses, and then maybe this bump, if you will, and that's something that's really starting on Tuesday, in rapid form, and it's likely one that will taper off, perhaps with a real ramp up towards opening day, whenever those establishments will open, etc. But then again, a steady state in the future. So if you could share with us perhaps your thoughts around resources and ramp-up period and just your view of the tasks ahead for the Bureau.
I think that part of what I find interesting about this job is that it is going to evolve over time. Gaming is new in Massachusetts. We are, starting a new industry, if you will, in the state. And from the perspective of the Investigation and Enforcement Bureau, you're correct. The first part of this job is to really do the investigations, the background investigations for the licensing. Once those licenses are granted, the job will somewhat change because I see the Investigation and Enforcement Bureau being more of a regulatory body. So there is the regulatory component of that scope of work for that part of the commission. I think that the experience in learning about the companies that are applying and going through that background process only helps with that regulatory process. So that background information and that knowledge about the industry and who's going to be in Massachusetts and who's going to do this this kind of work in Massachusetts is going to be critical to that regulatory piece. So I think you're building on that once you get into the regulatory piece. Then I also see that the IEB is really going to have to work hand in hand with the Attorney General's office on enforcement issues, and also with other state, federal, and local partners. So I think, as Commissioner Cameron mentioned, that atmosphere of collaboration is going to be very important. Information sharing is critical in any kind of enforcement operation. So I see the IEB is working with the other law enforcement entities in Massachusetts, and as we go from sort of the licensing phase into the regulatory phase and to the enforcement phase, we'll be working hand in hand with those partners, particularly the Attorney General's office, because there will be regulatory pieces and there will be criminal pieces that will probably merge, and we'll have to share information, share resources, and work together.
Is there yesterday the Attorney General announced
Yes.
her director of something somewhat similar. What is the distinction between what you'll be doing and that person will be doing?
Pat Hanley from the Attorney General's office will be assigned to the division at the AG's office. That's more of a criminal enforcement piece. So I expect that I would work very closely with AAG Hanley on issues and information that we glean as we go through the sort of the enforcement and regulatory process from the Commission's perspective. But the IEB is more of a regulatory piece of gaming, making sure that everything is happening properly as it should in the casinos, ensuring integrity for the process and ensuring integrity for the operations. I think there is going to be overlap, because anyone who's done criminal investigations knows you start down one path and you don't know where that's going to lead, and you get information and you have to be ready to move in different directions. And I think that the IEB is going to be working very closely with state police, local police. We may get information that may end up resulting in a criminal case. It may not. They may have information that they may think is going to be a criminal matter, but it turns out it may actually be more of a regulatory matter. So I think the interaction between the two is going to be very important, but the IEB is more on the regulatory side, and then the Attorney General's office is more on the criminal enforcement side.
Prosecution side.
Correct.
I think this, I mean, certainly to me, from the outside looking in, there are a lot of fingers in this pie.
Mm-hmm.
And it appears that the legislature did a pretty good job of empowering different agencies to do their piece of the puzzle, funding them. But it's going to take some organizational and administrative and personal skills to make sure that we're not overlapping, that we're not paying two agencies to do the same thing, that we don't get into turf wars and so forth, and I think that'll be as big a challenge probably as you have. Do you feel ready to deal with that one?
I absolutely do. I think one of the strengths I bring to this job is my ability to collaborate and to really get to know people that are working in this business. And I think that being able to pick up the phone, talk to people, share information, and work together and realize where you're overlapping, and being able to come up with a plan as a team and say, okay, this is where it makes sense for person A to do this, or person B to do this, and one agency to take the lead in one area, and maybe my agency to take the lead in another area is very important. That communication is critical in any kind of enforcement operation, so that you're not duplicating efforts, you're being efficient, and you're doing the work that you need to do.
One of the things, Madam Secretary, that I have been concerned about from the outset is the fact that in the regulatory sense, there is a disciplinary piece. There are license revocation kinds of hearings. There are investigations that lead to administrative charges. We're already looking at that in the racing side of things. And that means that we have within a single entity an investigative unit, a prosecutorial unit, and a fact-finding unit, which sets up a potential set of issues unless carefully addressed. Do you have any ideas as to how that could best be made to work?
Well, I think that, from the get-go, any kind of beginning, of any kind of investigation that each piece of the IEB and each role, as you described, has to know what their role is. And I think that as director, it's my responsibility to oversee that and to make sure that we're not going to delve into any kind of conflict. So I think it would be helpful, for the director, for me, to be able to manage those, the interviews, manage the evidence gathering, and make sure that there's no cross purposes, that if something is a regulatory investigation, that we see that. If it becomes criminal, we have to be mindful of, different constitutional protections and things like that. So I think that as far as managing that kind of work, it's important that there is someone overseeing it so that different individuals are not going in different directions. And I think that as far as the structure, I think that having investigators that know what they're doing, that are educated, that are familiar with this business, is the way to prevent problems in that area. And I think that where we're starting off now, we're in a good spot for that, and I would be bringing people in that are educated in that area and know how to do that.
That's certainly a helpful approach, but I was, in addition to the care that goes into the investigation piece and the care that goes into the prosecution piece, the adjudicatory piece can either be sent over to the Division of Administrative Law Judges, but may well be something we want to keep at home because it involves a certain amount of background expertise.
Yeah.
If we keep it home, we've got to make certain that both in the reality and the appearance, it is truly an independent fact finder. So
yes.
I just wondered if you had any time to think about that piece. We're not likely to need to get involved in it right away, although once the racing season starts, we will be.
And I think that when you have someone, and we've had dealt with hearings at the Department of Public Safety where you have an issue, and even though the hearings officer was an employee there, that hearings officer had to remain separate and had to not be privy to some of the information before the hearing. So I think you are 100% correct. It's not only the reality of the integrity of the process, but also the perception. So I think having a policy in place about keeping fact finders separate from the information until that information is provided is critical. Also, the process by which that information is provided, the hearing, the rules for the hearing, and the setup we have for the hearing is critical. I think having designating hearings officer, having the information provided in a public setting, and having that process outlined in public, and having a policy set up for how that's going to be done, so there is faith and belief in the process. I think that's very important. So I'd like to to discuss that further. I think that's very, very helpful.
Thank you.
I had a question about. It's our intention, and we've been diligent in searching, and Commissioner Stebbins is leading that search to bring in an executive director who has significant gaming experience, casino gaming experience, which means obviously we need to, and we're in the process of recruiting an individual from another state. So they would have that gaming experience, which we all think is critical, but they would not have that Massachusetts state government experience. Do you think you could be helpful to an executive director with the?
Yeah, I think that I see going forward, I hope that the director of the IEB, if that's me, and the executive director would have that kind of partnership. I think that we do need gaming experience in the Gaming Commission. However, because it's a new industry for Massachusetts, people from Massachusetts just don't have that experience, and that's just how it is right now. So I think that from the law enforcement perspective, it is very helpful to have the contacts to have the relationships, to know the judicial process here in Massachusetts, to know the administrative process here in Massachusetts. So I hope that I can be helpful to the executive director and bring that person up to speed on what's going on in Massachusetts, and then work in tandem with that executive director on the gaming issues, so we would complement each other. So, you know, given these are two high-level positions, I think that combination will serve the Commonwealth of Massachusetts the best. Thank you.
The legislation probably isn't more clear and definitive about any other bureau or position within the commission than this one. I mean, it clearly lays out the responsibilities of the IB and the responsibilities of the deputy director. In that sense, you're going to be hiring up staff.
Yeah.
I appreciate knowing your experience in hiring staff that have to have responsibilities and skills related to these functions, and what kind of people are you looking for to help fill a lot of these positions?
Yeah, I do have a significant amount of experience, in hiring, particularly as undersecretary at the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security. I was involved in not only the search process, for and the selection process, I should say, for the last two colonels. For Colonel McGovern, I was heavily involved, and then I led the process for the current Colonel, Timothy Albin. And in addition, we've had many executive positions within the executive office that I've been involved in that search. I'm very pleased with how that's turned out. So I think that I've demonstrated some good judgment as far as quality people to bring in. I think that as far as personnel for the Investigations and Enforcement Bureau, I think that experience and knowledge about financial investigations is going to be critical. This is a money business, and I think that having that background, that financial background, I think is going to be very helpful in that area. I think complementing that with the staff we're looking to, that we have, and then we're looking to have from the state police, who have a lot of investigative background, is going to be very productive for that bureau. So, I'm looking for people that are extremely intelligent, extremely diligent, and most importantly, extremely ethical. I think that integrity of this division is the most important thing to me. I think that we've said over and over, we have one chance to get this right, and there is there is nothing more important than the integrity of the people that work in the commission.
A little bit following up on Commissioner Stebbins' question, the legislation clearly identified, as he said, this as the sort of first among equals among the deputies, the next tier under the ED, to the extent that the legislation actually had the director of the IEB reporting to the chair, not to the ED. We have discussed that, and we've decided that we thought that responsibility should be delegated to the ED. What do you think of that distinction?
I think that the legislature, having that, be a direct report, shows the significance that it places on the IEB, and I think that is tied very heavily into the integrity of the Gaming Commission and the importance they place on being able to investigate things that are going wrong. That we want to get on top of that at the get-go, and we want to make sure that that this industry in Massachusetts is second to none. I think, though, however, that just operations-wise, it is going to be easier to report directly to the executive director. There's issues with the open meeting law and your ability to meet and communicate, and having to do that in an open meeting session. I think administratively, it's going to be a lot more efficient to have that report be to the executive director. So I think that'll work very well.
To a great degree, you've already sort of answered this question, but I want to pick up on a question that the chairman was asking relative to coordination among parties, state police, the attorney general, and that was in the context of the state. Could you share your thoughts relative to the country and the world, really, because now
Mm-hmm.
it's a global economy, and,
Yep.
and all of our licensees are national, but also probably global operators. What can you
Well, I think that,
share?
I've always been a believer that none of us is as smart as all of us, and that we can always gather better information. We can always learn about best practices in other areas. So I think having contacts with other jurisdictions that are doing gaming, with other operations, learning from their mistakes, learning from what they do well, and developing those relationships is extremely helpful in any kind of industry, but particularly helpful where we're an emerging industry here in Massachusetts. And I think that I would be remiss if I did not take that opportunity and try to learn from people who know what they're doing. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. If someone already knows how to do something very well, I want to go learn from that person, and I want to educate myself and just bring that to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
This is a question that we've talked to people in the gaming industry, and that would be a nice database to have, but I'd be interested in your instinct on this. Some people have said to us, when you start the regulatory environment, start as tough as you can get, because you can always back down from rigorous. Others have said, that's not fair. This is an industry like any other industry. It sort of needs a shakedown cruise. You don't want to have people held to the highest standards before they've had a chance to get organized. And so sort of start out by cutting some slack. Do you have an instinct on those two approaches?
Well, harken back to, my days as a prosecutor. I think, tough but reasonable is sort of a good mantra for that. I think that I would lean towards having very strict standards in Massachusetts. I think that the people of Massachusetts expect that this will be an honest and above-board process. But I think that the way to be reasonable and the way to work that out with the industry is open communication, information flow, and being able to let people know what the expectations are beforehand. It doesn't help the industry. I mean, we're here to not only to do enforcement, but we have an interest in having this be economically successful for the Commonwealth. So we don't want to dampen that unnecessarily. And I think that sort of managing expectations and informing parties that are going to be involved in this industry ahead of time, setting it up so nothing comes as a surprise, and being very open with the process and being very transparent about what the expectations are well ahead of time, so that the parties that are involved can easily live up to that. I think that's the way to manage it. That would be my instinct, but I'm certainly up for more discussion on that.
This is regulation of an industry rather than police work,
Correct.
in the purest sense of the word. So following up on your answer to the last question, which I think I understood, how do you see the difference between industrial regulation and sort of a law enforcement approach to a body of procedures and practices?
Yeah,
Purely law enforcement.
Yeah, I see the difference because, as the undersecretary, I not only, oversee the state police, so I understand the law enforcement world, but I also, oversee the Department of Public Safety, which deals, with building practices, the elevator industry, the hoisting licenses, I mean, that whole construction world, which is more of a business world. And I think that experience is going to be very helpful to me in this capacity, because in some ways this is much more like that, where there are people that have jobs, there are people that are working their businesses, and they have that interest, and we all have an interest in having that develop. So that sort of regulatory piece, in my experience, and that sort of regulatory piece I understand that it is a different world than law enforcement itself, that it's coming to resolutions, it's solving problems. We would come to issues with construction projects and what are we going to do here, and we'd work together. The commissioner at DPS is fantastic, and we would work with the industry and solve problems, not just come in there with a hammer and lay down the law. It's a matter of in that capacity, was making sure things were safe, making sure that there were not problems with elevators or escalators or buildings, and that people could have confidence in their structures. And similarly in the gaming industry, we want the industry to develop, but we want people to not only have faith that things are going properly, but that that they know that if there is a problem, there is an enforcement agency that's gonna step up.
What was your motivation to apply for this position?
I think that my interest, I have, in my background, I did a lot of proactive investigations as a prosecutor. I was in the Special Investigations Unit, both in the District Attorney's Office and and the Attorney General's Office. And then I also, worked at EOPS, and that was more of a policy administrative side. So what really appealed to me about this job was that there was a combination. It wasn't just administrative. There really is an operational piece to this, and there, is even right off the bat, getting involved in looking at those, looking at the applications, doing the background investigations, and actually doing the actual work, as opposed to just overseeing it from way up at the top. So getting to do both sides of things really appeals to me, and I find that would be a very good fit for my personality and for my skill set.
Anybody else?
No.
Well, now we have the interesting process of discussing the candidate in public, and I guess with her present, because she could, if she sits out there, she could watch it on her smartphone. So the hiring manager, Commissioner Cameron, has recommended Ms. Wells. What do you think?
I think it's a tremendous combination of experience, as she states, brings two pieces that are very important, this administrative oversight of certain departments, but also the prosecutorial and investigative side. And it's good to meet her and hear her respond to the questions very well. So I'm in full support of your recommendation.
Thank you. And I would just like to add the third piece, which I think is as important as the experience, and which is the respect she commands among the law enforcement leaders in the Commonwealth.
Detail that, because you haven't mentioned that to this
one of the things I do in vetting any candidate is do some back channel work. I mean, obviously, I expected references to say positive things about the candidate, but I certainly went beyond references and talked to many people about Undersecretary Wells, and people that didn't expect a call from me, frankly, and just the example after example of problem solving, not leaving anyone bloody on the floor, frankly, which is common in law enforcement. Solve the problem, work together, collaborate. Sometimes, and I speak from my own experience, federal government, state government, local government, county government, do not always, some of them skipped kindergarten, and they don't always work well together. And that's the skill set I thought was critical to this job, and that's what I heard, a resounding overall, that's the style, and that's what command, but also can make a tough decision, but do it in a way that people understand, and the respect is already there so that they will follow out. So I heard that over and over again, and I all along in evaluating this position thought that's we needed in someone was the ability to collaborate effectively.
I pick up on that point as well. I know as establishing a gaming commission without having a previous history of the industry in Massachusetts, we've been having our eye towards people with commission experience. But I think with this particular position and how clear the statute lays out that you need to work with the state police, you need to work with the Attorney General's office, you need to work with the Alcoholic Beverage Control Commission. I think it's somewhat appropriate for us to find a person who's had inside state government experience in Massachusetts, because it's not, it'd be great to have partnerships with these people. You have to have partnerships with these people. And I think having somebody who has the background already of having worked with some of those groups, I think that's important.
Well, I too, I know Secretary Wells by reputation. I think we had some prior contact in my former life, maybe not. But her reputation is terrific, and the answers to the questions she gave today, I think, exemplify why it is terrific. The difference between a pure law enforcement approach to things, which is an important part of this job, and a regulatory approach is really important to understand, not only intellectually, but viscerally, in my sense, from the answers Secretary Wells gave, because we are trying to make businesses grow, and we're trying to make them grow in a way that hews to lines that we all expect. But they are businesses we're trying to grow. And at the same time, there are going to be problems that need a law enforcement approach, a pure law enforcement, investigatory, prosecutorial approach. So I think in Secretary Wells, we really have somebody who's ready to take over this important position and advance the interests embodied in the legislation and advance the interests of the citizens of the Commonwealth. I'm delighted that she's agreed to come on board and join us.
Thank you.
I'm very mindful of the learning curve that's going to be there. You know, we all, I think, are mindful of the fact. I mean, we're now doing a stage of this process which we do have experience that is relevant to. That is the choosing of the licensees and the citing of the licensees. And I think we all bring something to the table. The actual regulation of the industry, once they get up and running, is something about which we know very little, and about which you know very little. But about which you're going to need to know a lot. And I'm mindful of that challenge, and you, like us, I think, are going to need, to immerse yourself in the meat and potatoes of the running of casinos, because that's what you're going to be regulating. Having said that, I agree with you about, we will have an ED who has those kinds of skills, and coupling that ED, such an ED, with a first among equals deputy who knows the local law enforcement world and brings the skills that you bring, I think makes all the sense in the world. But nevertheless, there is going to be that learning curve. I had a chance to talk to Undersecretary Wells for a little while, and I don't pretend to be a good enough interviewer to be able to know for sure. I do have a lot of confidence in Commissioner Cameron and the two other people, Kathy O'Toole, who has a tremendous background what's relevant for this, as well as being one of our consultants now, was part of the hiring review team, and a very senior member of the state police was also a part of the team. And to have those three people feel unequivocally that this is a very strong candidate, that gives me a lot of comfort. So, I'm certainly with the program. Would you like to make a motion?
I would, Mr. Chair. I would move that we vote to appoint Secretary Wells as our first Director of Investigations and Enforcement.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Any last-minute discussions, or forever hold your peace? You're sure?
I'm sure, sir.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Welcome aboard.
Thank you. Thank you
All
all
right.
very much.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Thank
Mr. Chair, I'm going to also have to
Okay,
excuse
great.
myself to make these meetings.
Yep, good, thank you. Director Wells, you have big shoes to fill. The interim director is a force to be reckoned with. Okay, Racing Division report. Director Durenberger and associated teammates. Thanks, Gail.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Mr. Chair, Commissioners.
Bring your mic over. You can introduce your guests.
I shall, as soon as we've decided how cozy we're going to be. Director Durenberger, Director of Racing. This is Danielle Holmes. She's a staff attorney, and Mr. David Murray, project consultant with us. First and foremost, I just want to say that this should be my last transition update. I can't promise that it will be, but it should be. The physical move involving 4 different locations, 4 different buildings yesterday was completed, and actually...
For the record, this is the move of the former State Racing Commission,
Yes.
which now is the Racing Division of the Mass Gaming Commission, is physically in the process of being completed.
Yes.
Right.
And the majority of the electronic files have been transferred over to the proper domains. There's just a few outstanding ticket items that should be completed by tomorrow. And at that point, I think it's 100% us. But we have, as I mentioned in the meeting last week, operations we took over at the racetracks on December 31st of 2012. And that activity is ongoing. I think the meat and potatoes of today's update is going to be this parimutuel and simulcast statute review. And then just a reminder to everybody, the Gaming Act in Section 104 required the Commission to review the simulcast and parimutuel laws for efficacy and for need to change. So
And did it require a report?
It did require a report to the legislature as
Okay.
well. Thank you. So what we thought we would do today is have a policy discussion based on what we feel are the important issues that we've discovered, unearthed, and researched, and then to come back to you next week with some firm recommendations on how to go forward. But we figured the policy discussion, starting that today, would be the best way to proceed. I'm going to have David Murray start with these, and Danielle and I will chime in as appropriate, and then I will summarize at the end.
Mr. Chairman, the 3 issues that we would like to present to the Commission as a policy matter are the issues that affect simulcasting, since both the parimutuel statutes and the Gaming Act have things to say about simulcasting. And then there's an issue regarding rebating and parimutuel wagering on credit. And some talk about the capital improvements and promotional trust funds and the process by which those funds are collected and spent in the regulatory process going from one to the other. So if we could start with simulcasting, and I think to understand what the issues are and to inform the policy approach to these issues, I should take us back prior to the passage of the Gaming Act. And before the Gaming Act was enacted, in order to simulcast, you had to have a racing license, and you had to conduct a minimum number of live races over a prescribed or minimum number of days. And you had to comply with rules related to carrying local race signals if you were bringing in signals from outside of Massachusetts. And you had to comply with an elaborate statutory takeout system, which funded a great many aspects of the racing industry. So at the point that the Gaming Act becomes law, a racing license is essential to the right to simulcast. And the Gaming Act acknowledges the continuation of the vitality of the racing statutes, that's to say,
chapters 128A and 128C, even in a gaming context where you have a racing licensee acquiring a gaming license. Indeed, sections 19 and 20 of the Gaming Act actually make compliance with the requirements of 128A and 128C a requirement for continued rights under your gaming license. Because if you don't do the things that you're supposed to do under 128A and 128C, the Gaming Act provides for the mandatory suspension of the gaming license. There is also the fact, though, that the Gaming Act in Section 7 creates two new potential simulcasting licensees. In Section 7B, the Commission is authorized to issue a simulcasting license to a gaming establishment and, if appropriate, to entities that were formerly licensed under the racing statutes. But the Act is, if not totally silent, at least doesn't say much about, expressly say, what the regulatory framework is to be for these new categories of simulcasting license. But the Act isn't utterly silent because there are a couple of provisions of the Act that point, at least in our view, to the legislative intent with respect to the idea of licensing non-racing licensees to simulcast. And I'll just take two examples. In Section 92 of the Session Law, which addresses the question of whether or not the former Greyhound racing tracks should be able to simulcast, had a choice before it, the legislature did. It could say that these ex-Greyhound tracks could proceed under Section 7. That's come to the Commission and say, give us a simulcasting license, or do something else. In fact, it did do something else. What it did was to make sure that that permission to those former Greyhound tracks was located right in the heart of the racing statutes. And Section 92 specifically says that they continue to be licensed as racing meeting licensees. Of course, because Greyhound racing was banned here, all the days of the year had to be dark days, days when no racing could take place. But it is significant that, at least in our view, that the legislature went through that exercise in order to locate the permission to simulcast for a non-racing applicant within chapters 128A and particularly 128C. And we take that to mean that the legislature had made a decision that no simulcasting or permission to simulcast could not be granted to a non-racing licensee outside of the regulatory framework of the gaming statute or 128A and 128C. So when we look at the question of how to harmonize the gaming statute with 128A and 128C, we have come to the conclusion, I think, or we are very close to coming to the conclusion, that Section 7B licensees should be subject to the same regulatory regime, if I can call it that, as the racing licensees. And what does that mean? That it means that we need to craft a regulatory model that preserves the obligations to carry the local signal if you are bringing in from out of Massachusetts a signal that is authorized, or a race meeting that's authorized here, that's licensed here. So that Plain Ridge is bringing in a thoroughbred signal. It would have an obligation to carry the Suffolk signal and vice versa. And there are obviously some regulations that are going to need to be written, or amendments to the statute that would make that system applicable to a non-racing licensee. How are the fees that are going to be chargeable for carrying of these, the compulsory carrying of these signals, going to be assessed? That's something that we are still working on. But that model, refined as we are going to refine it during the next week or so, is what we're going to bring to you. Because clearly, if you issue gaming licenses to current racing licensees in Massachusetts, you're going to have a mix that's not, at least at first blush, going to have the same competitive characteristics, you know, one to the other. It's not as if you have all non-racing or all racing licensees that are going to be simulcasted. And so these rules, we think, are going to have to be, are going to have to address that difference in the character of the licensees. So then we come to the rebating and wagering on credit aspect. We have looked at the issue of whether there is some articulable, quantifiable difference in the nature of the risk that's being wagered on as between games of chance with cards, dice, roulette wheels, and wagering on the speed of a horse or a harness race. And we are unable to come up with some articulable difference in that risk. And so...
Actually, if I could just stop you there, I think the only reason we see that we can find to treat the pari-mutuel customer differently than the casino customer is that the casino customer is betting against the house. The pari-mutuel customer is betting against other pari-mutuel customers. And so there are some differences, and I like to use the efficiencies of the market argument in that the pari-mutuel customer does need some protection in terms of us ensuring the efficiency of the market. And that's our regulatory structure in the simulcast and in the pari-mutuel regulations does that very zealously, I think, and will continue to do so. We're going to tighten that up a little bit. But to the extent that, other than the fact that they're facing the house versus facing each other, we don't see any distinction, especially when you're looking at a premise where someone may walk in the door and may come over here and play some slot machines and then go to that side of the room and place a pari-mutuel wager. Now they're the same customer even in the same room, per se.
Well, you might make some interesting differences in the nature of the betting or something, but it certainly doesn't seem to have any logical relationship to whether you could bet on credit or not. I mean, that seems like, right, okay.
And so to that extent, you know, I like to contextualize things, and I like to go back to the fact that, you know, the initial pari-mutuel wagering statutes were from the 1930s, and they were conceived in a time when, you know, the state was interested in protecting the gambler from himself. And I think we've come a long way now, and it's reflected in the Gaming Act that we understand that there are some people that do have compulsive gambling problems, and that, you know, that is a social entity, and we craft careful regulations to take care of that group of people, but we no longer try to protect people from themselves. And so I think modernizing this aspect of the statute is certainly important.
I don't quite agree with that characterization that we don't worry about protecting people from themselves. I mean, this, having an aggressive self-exclusion, for example, in casinos is, you know, so I take your point, but I wouldn't.
I could refine my point.
Okay.
But I think, Mr. Chairman, that her point is that that's in the regulation
Yeah,
already.
right. As a separate matter, right?
Correct.
Right.
And so we don't need
Right.
these prohibitions as added protections.
So the bottom line there is that whatever credit policy we create for casino gaming ought to be the same credit regulations we apply to pari-mutuel wager. Is
I
that,
think
is
that's fair
that
to say.
where you come out?
Yes.
Okay.
And incidentally, we were not able to find other states. Most states are very permissive. They don't have an exclusive prohibition. But the other states, the other structures that we looked at in terms of the pari-mutuel customer are permissive for these issues.
I think that Danielle may have found one state in which the only prohibition was against the licensee providing the credit to the gaming customer. And so to the last topic, the revisiting the capital improvements and promotional activities trust funds. The business model, as we understand it, is such that there is no longer any need that we can see in the commission providing supervision over licensees' utilization of its own money for promotional activities and for capital improvement funds. It's not that there is no a regulatory reason for requiring certain levels of capital improvements, but just in the question of how is that funded. The current system is it's expensive and it's cumbersome as a regulatory procedure where the tracks. There are a number of different kinds of takeout mechanisms, but essentially the tracks put the money in these funds, and in order to get it out, there are requirements that they hire lawyers and engineers. They produce an elaborate proposal to the commission, and the commission then has to go through this proposal and decide whether or not this is an appropriate way to spend these funds. And we have looked at this, and I think we are very close to recommending that we scrap that system. Give back the so-called breaks to the tracks, and set up a fund for capital improvements where we think they're really needed, which is for the backside folks who need, in our view, targeted, earmarked takeouts. And as a director will tell you, this is a movement that is catching some wind in the country, and we think that Massachusetts ought to be out in front of this.
And so just to clarify, it would be some small percentage of the total amounts. Certainly the tracks, the amounts, the monies that go into the capital improvement and the promotional trust funds are the breaks. And the breaks are these odd cents. Again, this is a racing history lesson. So if you were the pari-mutuel customer and you wager $2 on a horse, and the actual mathematical calculation is $2.17 is what you win. Mutual tellers don't deal in pennies historically. And so there had to be some way to deal with that. And the way that it's been dealt with is that those odd cents over some multiple of either 5 or 10, depending if they dealt in nickels, was basically kept by the House. Now, different states have approached that differently. Sometimes it goes into various funds, sometimes it goes to the track, sometimes it actually goes to the commission. In Massachusetts, it goes into this fund here. And then there's some additional small percentages depending on whether, I think, whether or not it's a live race or a simulcast race. There's some additional small percentages that go in there. So I think what we're proposing is not to take away that, not to abolish the funds and then take all that money and put it into this backside improvement fund, but to take some small percentage. And the reason for that.
To take some small percentage of what?
Of the breaks.
Okay.
And put them in this, what we propose would be a backside improvement fund, which would go towards improving, say, dormitory areas. For example, at Suffolk, we have people that live on the backside, protecting the safety and welfare of the horses through improving the barn structure. There are some differences between our current licensees in terms of the barn area, the size, the number of horses that are housed there, and whether or not there are dormitories. So we need to look at what would be fair for the two licensees.
What's their reaction to this idea?
So far, it's been positive. I mean, obviously, they want to know what the number is, because
Yeah.
that's important. But I think the industry is watching, and I think that as business operators, I think they're aware of the fact that the industry is watching. And we've found 2 states that have gaming that have started to go down this route and have similar funds. And that's been very well received in the industry. People are watching, and the horse players are watching as well.
Who has control over these funds, typically?
I think that you could, the commission could, in their regulations, as part of their license application process, be very clear in their regulations that we would need to see, again, we have to refine the recommendation, but I think you can handle it via regulation. And I think you put it either in the licensee's obligations section or in the application section.
But the licensee would have control of the funds subject to constraints as to how they're spent. Can I go back for a second?
Sure.
Where are the breaks, where do the breaks go now?
They currently go into these funds.
Into the funds directly?
Yes.
Yeah. And why would we not put the entirety of the breaks into the funds under this new scheme, but only a portion of it?
Because I think that when you look at the business model, the 100% of this pot, which is for capital improvements and also promotional trust, which was advertising, lowering cost of admission and parking fees and things like that, which again is from rather an antiquated business model. I think that if you're a business operator, you do still have some capital improvement needs, and I do think that that is in the interest of the horse player. So in other words, for us to make sure that facilities that the pari-mutuel customer go to be maintained, I don't think that we should take it all and put it towards improving the life of the occupational licensees.
So the advertising, the promotion piece of the breaks would still be available to the operators?
To the tracks to use as they see fit.
Do the breaks always favor the house? I mean, I think that's a silly question. But
Well, do they favor the house? They are rounded down, if
they're
that's what
rounded
you're-
down,
yes.
that's what I meant.
Yeah, and
That's why I made it a silly question.
It's, I think, you've heard the term, them's the breaks, right? I mean, that's a
Oh,
negative
really?
term,
Is that
right?
where that comes from?
That's a negative term, right? The pushback, of course, is from the pari-mutuel customer, and I think they're very sensitive to where those breaks go, because for them, it operates as a tax, because the net pool that's distributed to the pari-mutuel customer is exclusive of those breaks. So in other words, those come out, and then what's left gets distributed. So it operates like a tax to them. However, having said that, they are watching where they go. And so if the track just keeps it wholeheartedly, it's less savory than if some of it is being earmarked to improve the industry. I mean, having a better life for the horses and the people back there improves the product that they're gambling on. And so there is support for this backside improvement fund among the pari-mutuel customers as well.
And just to pick up, Commissioner, on the question that you asked about the size, well, not a whole lot. When, as originally conceived, these breaks were to go to capital improvements for the entire track. So that we're talking about a relatively large sum of money for a relatively large.
Right.
Okay.
So it's an earmark essentially, saying carve out a little bit and sure it goes to the backside.
Yes.
and take the commission out of the administration of it.
That's the second point.
To a large
Right, so
part.
you currently operate as trustees for these funds, and then you have a statutory requirement to consult with, to hire third-party services, so an architectural firm or an engineering firm. So there's a statutory burden on you as well to review these proposals before we give the money back. And we think we can craft savory regulation that will effectuate the purpose that we're
Can I go back to the first one? The big issue is, the bigger issue is the first one, and let me just make sure if I sort of vaguely get this. There are, 7B of the Gaming Act creates 2 new categories of simulcast licensees.
potential.
Potential,
licenses, yeah.
right. One is a recipient of a gaming license, and another is anybody who used to have a racing license. But there's no accompanying regs and, and rules about how they should be managed. It's not similar rules about the revenue sharing and so forth.
There is a 10% takeout.
Right, but it's not
right?
similar, it's different.
It's not, yeah.
Right, so, and what you're suggesting is that those people licensed under 7B ought to adhere to the same basic operating rules and standards and revenue sharing as the existing licensees.
Or some iteration, some mutation of the current
Right.
system.
Okay.
But with the revenue sharing piece, though, this racehorse development fund, this gets to another layer of issues, which is monies that are targeted for purse accounts versus monies that are going to the operator. And that was sort of, I think, touched upon in the introduction. We maybe didn't get into it in the same depth that we treated the others.
But I don't want to, at the moment, I don't care about where the money goes. I'm just trying to figure out who are all these licensees that floating around. So when the 128A and C sunset, which is July 31, 2014, at that point, do I understand correctly that the only possible racing licensees, simulcase licensees, will be people who have a gaming license or people who used to have a simulcast license? Or, I'm sorry, used to have a racing license.
Unless, on or before that date, the legislature does
Right,
what
I
it's always
understand,
been doing.
but that's true of everything. So, who has a simulcast license now would not be able to have a simulcast license after 2014?
If the question is, question of qualification, so who is disqualified and who is not disqualified, everyone would be qualified. Because
Everybody-
they would be former,
So everybody who today has a simulcast license would have a right to have a simulcast license in August of 2014.
no, they would not,
To apply.
Mr. Chairman.
To
They
apply
wouldn't
for-
have
I'm
a
sorry,
right.
not a right to have it, would have the right to apply for it.
Yes, Apply for it.
Would have the option at our discretion. Sorry, I misspoke. Okay. So, and then we have, under 7B or anywhere else in our statute, the ability to regulate those folks. It sounds like you've said we could deal with harmonizing the rules and regs under which various simulcast licensees operate now. We can manage that. So I'm sure we could manage that in August of 2014. So is there anything we can't do to manage the simulcast industry just with our own authority from here on out?
Well, that's a somewhat complicated question because the commission, as an administrative law issue, only has regulatory powers with respect to what it's authorized to regulate. Now, so that is the background. If the question is, whether the commission has or would have after the sunset date a regulatory power with respect to licenses issued under Chapter 23K, which obviously 7B is in.
Yeah.
I think the answer to that question is, at least in our view, yes. You would have.
Right.
Because the powers. that are
Okay, I agree
given-
with that, so we agree, but so what's the but clause? So that means, yes, we would have the ability to license anybody, the entire simulcast industry.
Yes.
Not only licensed, but
And
regulated.
regulated,
Correct.
sorry, licensed and regulated
Correct.
appropriately, right?
Correct.
So there's,
That's in our view, yes.
okay, so the answer, as you're understanding it, is that whether the legislature wants to do something or not is a whole nother question.
Right.
But in terms of whether we have the tools to regulate the industry, sounds like you think we do.
Yes.
Without legislative intervention.
Bearing in mind that if nothing happened, there was no legislative action at the end of July of 2014, those simulcasting licenses that derived from 128A and 128C obviously would lapse, and they would have to, current licensees.
Right, well, I understand that, and that's a legislative matter. But at the moment, the legislature has given us our marching orders. And it's, as you pursue this thought process and as you make recommendations to us and by way of us to the legislature, we have on repeated occasions gotten the message that the legislature constructed a very complicated, very nuanced bill. And it is not interested in reopening that bill but for the very best of reasons. And what they consider the best of reasons is for them to decide. It's not up to us to decide. But they have been clear in saying to us, you know, we gave you the tools to do this job. And we want you to do the job. If you really need us to intervene, or if for some other reason, on their own, for whatever reasons, we choose to intervene, they can obviously do that. But they're not anxious to do our job for us if we have the tools to do it.
We understand that, Mr.
Okay,
Chairman.
so as we look into this, you know, to having that in mind and making sure that we're not asking the legislature, I mean, again, the legislature can do whatever it wants, that's not our business, you know, but that we're not asking them to do anything that we don't need to ask them to do is important, I think.
Yes.
Okay.
And they, just to remind you that they actually have in our mandate to file a report. They have indeed asked us for recommended statutory language.
Right.
If we think it's appropriate. But
Yeah.
that obviously is in the context of what you've just said.
Right,
And we're
right.
fully aware of that and sensitive to that.
Okay.
Well, we have even a bigger, pursuant to this discussion, and this is a helpful thing, it's, because the mandate is the analysis that we're required to provide shall include a review of the efficacy of the laws, that's 128A and C that were in effect on the date of the statute, and the need to replace those laws pursuant to the continuation of chapters 128A and 128C of the general laws in this act. Pursuant to the continuation sort of doesn't make sense pursuant to, but let's put that to one side. So we have the power, if we so choose, to recommend that that there is no need to replace those laws. That we, through our regulatory powers, have the power to create a sound regulatory environment for parimutuel and simulcast racing. Because pursuant to the regulatory powers, we could reinstate those portions of 128A and 128C that were necessary to carry that on, right?
Or such other rules and regs as
Or such other, yeah.
Well,
Or is that not the path down which you?
I need to think about that, Commissioner, for the following reason. As I said before, the commission is authorized, or can regulate only what it's authorized to regulate.
Right.
So, it would have to purport to regulate
Right.
under 23K and only under 23K.
Right.
So then the question would arise.
Which is a license granting enabling act, a license
Correct.
granting enabling section.
Right.
Right.
So the question would then become, following your question, what would be the statutory authority, for example, to require simulcast licensees to carry local signals? And I'm not suggesting that it's an open and shut answer one way or the other, but the answer is complicated.
But Section 5A says that the commission shall promulgate regulations for the implementation, administration, and enforcement of this chapter,
Yes.
including without limitation, and it goes on to list a bunch of stuff.
Right.
That's pretty broad.
Well, except, it is broad, I agree with you, but the question is whether it's broad enough to withstand a challenge based on the following proposition. If you are not specifically authorized to regulate some particular aspect of simulcasting, and when I say specifically authorized, I mean statutory authorization, then arguably, if the commission were to attempt to regulate that, they may be a challenge based on the fact that either the commission has no authority to do that, or if it does, that the legislature has in effect delegated its legislative authority with respect to the particular issue.
Well, the delegation issue is there. I agree with you, and that goes back to law school, fascinating law school discussions, and some real-world problems.
Yes.
But, so I'm with you there. But suppose the legislature really meant to repeal 128A and 128C effective July 31, 2014, and leave 7B and 5A in its wake, i.e., leave the licensing power and the regulatory power in the hands of the commission. And suppose we get to January 31st and there is no 128A or C. Then we are thrust into, say for the delegation argument, the requirement that we promulgate a series of regulations, right?
Yes.
Okay, so that may or may not happen. But how do we deal with this issue, the 7B issue that you've just described, in an environment where that might be the legislative intent, and for all that is written on paper, that's really all we have except precedent?
Well, the pragmatic answer is that I think the commission would have to issue, promulgate regulations. And one of the positive things about that is to argue that the legislature would end simulcasting in that way by simply failing to act.
They didn't fail to act.
No. I'm saying that if the legislature did nothing to
128A.
repeal the repeal of 128A and C, then certainly simulcasting under those statutes would end because of the legislative failure to act. I mean, factually.
Okay. The reason I raised this question, and you've done a thoughtful job of weaving us through these rather tortuous provisions, is that the specific question is, tell us about the efficacy of the current laws and the need to replace them. And it is open to us, therefore, is it not, to say the laws were efficacious, but there's no need to replace them. We can handle it.
Yes. Yes.
Particularly in the context of what I was saying earlier, you know. I mean, we're gonna have this conversation, as you know, we're gonna have this conversation and leave it open for a week or two while we think further and while our friends in the industry and so forth comment. And we're interested to hear what other people have to say, and the legislature comment too. And we will, as we have another similar issues, we will talk with them and get their advice. But I do know there is this overriding parameter that it took 20 or 30 years to build this bill, and it is not a bill that they want to mess with unless they have to or choose for their own reasons to. So that, I think, fits with your bottom line point.
Well, except that they could go into 128A and 128C and not touch,
I understand that, but they think of them as.
I hear you.
Yeah.
But I would really welcome, and perhaps we could put that up, of what, on the website and invite comments as to what people generally thought of an answer that said, there's no need to replace 128A and 128C. We've got the regulatory authority we need, and we've got best practices, and we can take them. I mean, it may be that we wind up not going down that route, but I would like to know what people said about that before we make a final decision.
Yeah, when we post this, Janice, are you following this? You know, when we post this for discussion, let's add that.
That might provoke a firestorm.
It won't be the first time. Won't be the first one about this business. Okay, well, this is fascinating.
It's
I
really
actually
very thoughtful.
more or less understand it at this point, so.
Very helpful.
Yeah, and we will look forward to people's comments, and we will talk with the legislature, and if anything else left for you to run to ground to feel comfortable to give us your final recommendations would be good.
We're going to try to come back next week, Mr. Chairman, with something.
Yeah, okay. Well, we should say, so let's say it's going to be a week. If it turns out we take two, we'll take two, but let's say that there'll be a week comment period. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody need a break? Are you ready to keep rolling?
We don't have a lot more, do we?
We have
Regulation
promulgation process, right, and a little bit of key policy.
Which is just a stage setting.
Yep, right.
So let's keep going.
So let's keep going. I'm told.
Hello.
Hello, Attorney Glovsky, Grossman,
Yes.
yeah, whatever. One of those G attorneys.
I don't respond to either.
You're here to talk about your memorandum on regulation promulgation strategy.
Yes, I've submitted for your consideration a memorandum detailing a plan for which the comprehensive gaming regulations can be adopted. We're certainly at a point where of course, the application deadline is impending, and the certain investigations are already underway. It's, of course, important that we get these comprehensive regulations in place and get a writing process together. So, in order to ensure that we're able to do it at once efficiently and thoughtfully, I've made the following recommendations to you. This has been reviewed by the gaming consultants and our legal consultants, who will play a role in this process. And certainly the commissioners will play a critical role in the process as well, undoubtedly. And I'll just quickly hit some of the highlights for you. And the end goal, I think, would be to make any adjustments necessary and seek approval of this plan so we can commence the drafting process. The first thing that I'm suggesting is that we put together a comprehensive outline of what the regulations will ultimately look like. Essentially, it would be an index that lays out all of the subject areas that regulations will be required in, with the understanding that at this point, we won't be able to draft regulations in all those areas. That being said, in order to ensure that we don't end up with a patchwork of regulations, we will be able to plug in the priority regulations into the appropriate area. After discussion of this with the gaming consultants, they have agreed to provide us with that by the end of this week, and we intend to discuss this further with them early next week, Monday, to highlight some priority areas and to make some assignments, as I'll get into in a moment. But as I've noted on the in the memo, some of the areas regulations already exist in, others regulations will be necessary. There are certainly some on this list that we can identify as not being a priority, and those will have to be done shortly after we finish this essentially second phase. So there'll be a third phase of regulations as well. But of course, we need regulations in the area of the phase 2 regulations and the slots and some other issues dealing with surrounding communities, things of that nature that we'd like to be able to get to you as soon as possible. So there are certain areas like the rules of some of the games, the ABCC regulations, the problem gaming regulations, things of that nature that aren't of imminent importance that we wouldn't intend to focus on at first. Those would likely be in the second phase of this process. Once we get a outline together, which hopefully we would have to you for review at your next meeting, which would include highlighting of priority areas. It would include assignments of the different areas. We would bring it to you for consideration. At that point, if any individual commissioner expresses an interest in either drafting regulations in a particular area or being involved in the drafting of regulations in a particular area, we would identify that on the outline at that point. At that point, we'd start drafting the regulations in earnest. The legal department would serve as the point of contact for the gaming consultants, for Anderson and Krieger, for any commissioners, to ensure that there is a uniform process in place and that everyone knows where to go with any inquiries. At that point, we would also work to weave in the intricacies of the general laws, primarily Chapter 23K. We would have an outline of all of the policy decisions that the Commission has made to date and make efforts to the extent that they implicate any of the priority areas to weave those into the initial draft regulations. Once we have a draft of the priority regulations, I will take a look at that with our legal staff in consultation with Anderson and Krieger. They will be circulated to all of the commissioners for review. At that point, any commissioner who has any issues with any of the language can come consult with the legal staff. We'll make any adjustments if they are of more of an administrative nature. If they're more substantive, we'll have to look at them. The legal staff will compile a list of areas that will need review. That list will be circulated to the commissioners, so when you sit down at a meeting to discuss the draft regulations, you won't be presented with potential issues for the first time. You'll have had an issue to consider what some of the issues are. At that point, you'll sit down, you will make an initial deliberation over the regulations, approve them for purposes of commencing the 30A process. We will, at that point, make all the required notifications to both the Secretary of State, Local Government Advisory Committee, and to the newspapers. Allow for public comment. We will schedule a public hearing. Take in any public comment that on any of the regulations. We will make any changes that come from that, and finally file them with the Secretary of State. We are in the process of working on timing for all of these things, and we hope to be able to hammer that out in the near future. And then we can review the commission's chart where it lays out some of these dates and hopefully be able to revise some of those timelines to make it a little quicker. So that's, those are the highlights of this memo. If there are any specific areas that you'd like to discuss, I'd certainly be happy to answer any questions.
In just my own thoughts, I mean, reviewing this is pretty thorough, it's pretty concise, it's an appropriate process to lay out without having us hopscotch around a bunch of different issues. Do you look at the outline particular where it talks about the area of regulations, and obviously there are going to be some that are going to be a pretty hearty, thoughtful discussion laying out of regs, like, you know, phase 2 is going to be huge. But as you get further down the list, I would hope that there are going to be some that we're going to be able to maybe pull from best practices from other jurisdictions. So even though it might be low-hanging fruit, I think it does make sense to kind of keep these all in the timeline that you've laid out, so we don't kind of, let's not hopscotch and go around and see training schools, because we know, you know, we have a version that we can use based on another jurisdiction. It helps to kind of keep it all in focus and in line with how you lay these out in terms of priorities.
Well, I think the possibility certainly exists that things will move quicker than anticipated, and that we'll be able to fill in more than we thought.
Right.
In order, though, to move the priority regulations as quickly as possible, my sense is that we won't be able necessarily to get to all of even the low-hanging fruit, which is why we've kind of set this up, just so there aren't any expectations that we can't realistically meet. And I think once the licensing process is in place, or the regulations governing that, some of these other things will be able to easily be filled in, and we won't miss a beat at all. It won't slow the process down whatsoever.
It's not really responsive to your point, was it? Weren't you just saying that we ought to make sure that we don't reinvent the wheel where we can avoid reinventing the wheel, and that will save us a bunch of time?
Yeah, no, I agree with the process. I agree with how you've prioritized these other issues. And I do like the fact that there are probably, as you look down this list, some topics where we could easily go out and say, for sense of accomplishment, that we just grab regs from another jurisdiction and say, boom. But instead of doing, you know, that cherry picking, I think it makes sense to stick with the schedule and stick with priorities as he has them laid out.
Yeah, and
knowing that some aren't going to take as long as obviously, you know, the bulk of the work. You know,
I agree with not reinventing the wheel. We certainly don't want to reinvent the wheel. I think what I found in just my preliminary review when we looked at the gaming schools, for example, is that there are a number of different approaches that are taken by different jurisdictions. So even though we wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel, you would have to look at 3 or 4 different models and figure out which one you want to go with. And that could certainly slow down the process of getting the RFA 2 regs in place. And that's all I'm suggesting.
Okay. I get that. It seemed to me, Todd, that you sort of brought the calendar in at the last minute, and I just think that it's very important that you have that calendar in front of you now. First of all, that calendar establishes an outside date, and we hope, we've already talked about, you know, a month of fat in that public process. So just be as aggressive from the get-go as you can, rather than going through it all and then coming back and look at the chart. I know that's really not quite what you meant, but it's what you said was, then we'll come and look at the chart and see whether we can fit it in there and pick up a little time. You just want to be sensitive to the time issue right from the start and push the envelope as hard as you can, that's all.
I think that'll certainly be the approach we'll look to take, realistically speaking, though.
Right. And as you know, we're moving the background checks as aggressively as we can. If we get the background checks before the regs are ready, we can't doesn't do anything for us. So we need to make those two moving forward as fast as we can in parallel.
Right. And certainly, we will have to discuss dates and the like in the near future. We're just in the process of trying to hammer those out.
Okay. Great. Anything else? Thank you. Key policy questions, item number 8 is just a, I'm going to throw the ball to you. I've forgotten what we talked about here, just to clarify the schedules.
We just wanted to let people know the meetings are scheduled for Tuesday, January 22nd, and Wednesday, January 23rd, from 1 to 5 here in this room. We'll be reposting the questions that we'll be covering during those 2 meetings. They've been posted previously when we did the first round, and people have submitted comments. We welcome additional comments, but if you've already sent comments in and have no changes, there's no reason to resubmit at this point. We've already taken note of those, so.
Great. And that is all she wrote, unless there's anything else. Anybody else? Motion to adjourn. Second. Second. All in favor?
Aye.
We are adjourned. Thank you.